Chapter VLL. Critical Criticisms Correspondence 1. The critical mass. Where can one feel better than in the bosom of one's family? In its absolute existence as Herr Bruno, critical criticism has declared the mass of mankind, the whole of mankind that is not critical criticism, to be its opposite, its essential object, essential, because the mass exists ad majorem gloriam Dei, the glory of criticism, of the spirit, its object, because it is only the matter on which critical criticism operates. Critical criticism has proclaimed its relationship to the mass as the world historic relationship of the present time. No world historic opposition is formed, however, by the statement that one is in opposition to the whole world. One can imagine that one is a stumbling block for the world, because one is clumsy enough to stumble everywhere. But for world historic opposition it is not enough for me to declare the world my opposite. The world for its part must declare me to be its essential opposite, and must treat and recognize me as such. Critical criticism ensures itself this recognition by its correspondence, which is called upon to bear witness before the world to criticism's function of redeemer, and equally to the general irritation of the world at the critical gospel. Critical criticism is its own object as the object of the world. The correspondence is intended to show it as such, as the world interest of the present time. Critical criticism is in its own eyes the absolute subject. The absolute subject requires a cult. A real cult requires other believing individuals. The Holy Family of Charlottenburg therefore receives from its correspondence the cult due to it. The correspondence tell it what it is and what its adversary, the mass, is not. However, criticism falls into an inconsistency by thus having its opinion of itself represented as the opinion of the world, and by its concept being converted into reality. Within criticism itself a sort of mass is forming, a critical mass whose simple function is untiringly to echo the stock phrases of criticism. For consistency's sake this inconsistency may be forgiven. Not feeling at home in the sinful world, critical criticism must set up a sinful world in its own home. The path of critical criticism's correspondent, a member of the critical mass, is not a rosy one. It is a difficult, thorny path, a critical path. Critical criticism is a spiritualistic lord, pure spontaneity, actus purus, intolerant of any influence from without. The correspondent can therefore be a subject only in appearance, can only seem to behave independently towards critical criticism, can only seemingly want to communicate something new and of his own to it. In reality he is critical criticism's own product, its perception of its own voice made for an instant objective and self-existing. That is why the correspondents do not fail to assert incessantly that critical criticism itself knows, realizes, understands, grasps, and experiences what at the same moment is being communicated to it for appearance's sake. Thus Zerlander, for instance, uses the expressions, do you grasp it? You know. You know for the second and third time. You have probably heard enough to be able to see for yourself. So too the Breslau correspondent Fleischhammer says, but the fact, etc., will be as little of a puzzle to you as to me. Or the Zurich correspondent Herzl, you will probably find out for yourself. The critical correspondent has such anxious respect for the absolute understanding of critical criticism that he attributes understanding to it even where there is absolutely nothing to understand. For example, Fleischhammer says, you will perfectly understand me when I tell you that one can hardly go out without meeting young Catholic priests in their long black cowls and cloaks. Indeed, in their fear the correspondents hear critical criticism saying, answering, exclaiming, deriding. Zerlander, for example, says, but you say. Well, then, listen. And Fleischhammer, yes, I hear what you say. I'll only mean that. And Herzl, good for you, you will exclaim. 11 and a Tübingen correspondent, do not laugh at me. 11 The correspondents, therefore, also express themselves as though they were communicating facts to critical criticism and expect from it the spiritual interpretation. They provide it with premises and leave the conclusion to it, or they even apologize for repeating things criticism has known for a long time. Zerlander, for example, says, your correspondent can only give a picture, a description of the facts. The spirit which animates these things is certainly not unknown to you. Or again, now you will surely draw the conclusion for yourself. And Herzl says, I shall not presume to entertain you with the speculative proposition that every creation rises out of its extreme opposite. Sometimes, too, experiences correspondence are merely the fulfillment and confirmation of criticism's prophecies. Fleischhammer, for example, says, your prediction has come true. And Zerlander, the far from being disastrous, the tendencies that I have described to you as gaining ever greater scope in Switzerland, are very fortunate. They only confirm the thought you have already often expressed, etc. Critical criticism sometimes feels urged to express the condescension involved by its participation in the correspondence and motivates this condescension by the fact that the correspondent has successfully carried out some task. Thus Herr Bruno writes to the Tübingen correspondent, it is really inconsistent on my part to answer your letter. On the other hand, you have again made such an apt remark that I cannot refuse the explanation you request. Critical criticism has letters written to it from the provinces, not the provinces in the political sense, which, as we know, do not exist anywhere in Germany, but from the critical provinces of which Berlin is the capital, Berlin, the seat of the critical patriarchs and of the Holy Critical Family, whereas the provinces are where the critical mass resides. The critical provincials dare not engage the attention of the supreme critical authority without bows and apologies. Thus, someone writes anonymously to Herr Edgar, who, being a member of the Holy Family, is also an eminent personage. Honorable Sir, I hope you will excuse these lines on the grounds that young people like to unite in common strivings. There is not more than 2 years difference in our ages. The coeval of Herr Edgar describes himself incidentally as the essence of modern philosophy. Is it not in the nature of things that criticism should correspond with the essence of philosophy? If Herr Edgar's coeval affirms that he has already lost his teeth, that is only an allusion to his allegorical essence. This essence of modern philosophy has learned from Feuerbach to set the factor of education in objective view. It at once gives a sample of its education and views by assuring Herr Edgar that it has acquired a complete view of his short story, Es Leben fest Grundsatz. 11. At the same time it openly admits that Herr Edgar's point of view is by no means quite clear to it, and finally invalidates the assurance concerning the complete view by the question, or have I completely misunderstood you? 11. After this sample it will be found quite normal that the essence of modern philosophy, referring to the mass, should say, we must at least once condescend to examine and untie the magic knot which bars common human reason from access to the unrestricted flood of thought. In order to get the complete view of the critical mass one should read the correspondence of Herr Herzl from Zurich, Heft V. This unfortunate man memorizes the stock phrases of criticism with really touching docility and praiseworthy power of recall, not omitting Herr Bruno's favorite phrases about the battles he has waged and the campaigns he has planned and led. But Herr Herzl exercises his profession as a member of the critical mass especially by raging against the profane mass and its attitude to critical criticism. He speaks of the mass claiming a part in history, of the pure mass, of pure criticism, of the purity of this contradiction, a contradiction purer than any that history has provided, of the discontented being, of the perfect emptiness, ill humor, dejection, heartlessness, timidity, fury and bitterness of the mass towards criticism, of the mass which only exists in order by its resistance to make criticism sharper and more vigilant. He speaks of creation from the extreme opposite, of how criticism is above hate and similar profane sentiments. The whole of Herr Herzl's contribution to the literature Ch8-9 is confined to this profusion of critical stock phrases. While reproaching the mass for being satisfied with mere disposition, goodwill, the phrase, faith, etc., he himself, as a member of the critical mass, are content with phrases, expressions of his critical disposition, his critical faith, his critical goodwill, and leaves action, work, struggle, and works to Herr Bruno and company. Despite the terrible picture of the world historic tension between the profane world and critical criticism which the members of the critical mass outline, for the non-believer at least not even the fact of the matter is stated, the factual existence of this world historic tension. The obliging and uncritical repetition of criticism's imaginations and pretensions by the correspondence only proves that the fixed ideas of the master are the fixed ideas of the servant as well. It is true that one of the critical correspondents makes an attempt at a proof based on fact. You see, he writes to the Holy Family, that the literature Ch8-9 is fulfilling its purpose, that is, that it meets with no approval. It could meet with approval only if it sounded in unison with the general thoughtlessness, if you strode proudly before it with the jingling of hackneyed phrases of a whole janissary band of current categories. The jingling of hackneyed phrases of a whole janissary band of current categories. It is evident that the critical correspondent does his best to keep pace with non-current hackneyed phrases. But his explanation of the fact that the literature Ch8-9 meets with no approval must be rejected as purely apologetic. This fact could be better explained in just the opposite way by saying that critical criticism is in unison with the great mass, to be precise, the great mass of scribblers who meet with no approval. It is therefore not enough for the critical correspondent to address critical hackneyed phrases to the Holy Family as prayers and at the same time to the mass as anathemas. Uncritical, mass-type correspondents, real delegates of the mass to critical criticism, are needed to show the real tension between the mass and criticism. That is why critical criticism also assigns a place to the uncritical mass. It makes unbiased representatives of the latter correspond with it, acknowledge the opposition to itself, criticism, as important and absolute, and utter a fearful cry for redemption from this opposition. 2. The uncritical mass and critical criticism, i.e. the obdurate mass and the unsatisfied mass, the hardness of heart, the obduracy and blind unbelief of the mass as one rather determined representative. This representative speaks of the exclusively Hegelian philosophical education of the Berlin Scholar. The only true progress that we can make, he says, lies in the acknowledgement of reality. But we learn from you that our knowledge was not knowledge of reality but of something unreal. He calls natural science the basis of philosophy. A good naturalist stands in the same relation to the philosopher as the philosopher to the theologian. Further, he comments as follows on the Berlin Scholar. I do not think it would be exaggerating to try to explain the state of these people by saying that, although they have gone through a process of spiritual milking, they have not yet altogether got rid of their old skin in order to be able to absorb the elements of renovation and rejuvenation. We must yet assimilate this natural, scientific and industrial knowledge, the knowledge of the world and of man, which we need most of all, cannot be acquired only by acuity of thought. All the senses must collaborate and all the aptitudes of man must be applied as indispensable instruments. Otherwise contemplation and knowledge will always remain defective and will lead to moral death. This correspondent, however, sweetens the pill that he hands out to critical criticism. He makes Bauer's words find their correct application. He has followed Bauer's thoughts. He agrees that Bauer has spoken the truth, and in the end he seems to polemize, not against criticism itself, but against a Berlin Scholar, which is distinct from it. Critical criticism, feeling itself hit and, moreover, being as sensitive as an old maid in all matters of faith, is not taken in by these distinctions and this semi-homage. You are mistaken, it answers, if you have taken the party you described at the beginning of your letter for your opponent. Rather admit, and now comes the crushing sentence of excommunication, that you are an opponent of criticism Itzlufel, the miserable wretch. The man of the mass. An opponent of criticism itself. 1. But as far as the content of that mass-type polemic is concerned, critical criticism declares its respect for its critical attitude to natural science and industry. All respect for natural science, all respect for James Watt and, a really noble turn. No respect at all for the millions that he made for his relatives. All respect for the respect of critical criticism. In the same letter in which critical criticism reproaches the above-mentioned Berlin Kohler with too easily disposing of thorough and solid works without studying them and having finished with a work when they have merely remarked that it is epoch-making, etc. That same letter criticism itself disposes of the whole of natural science and industry by merely declaring its respect for them. The clause which it appends to its declaration of respect for natural science reminds one of the first fulminations of the deceased Knight Krug against natural philosophy. Nature is not the only reality because we eat and drink it in its individual products. Critical criticism knows this much about the individual products of nature that we eat and drink them. All respect for the natural science of critical criticism. Criticism is consistent in countering the embarrassingly importunate demand to study nature and industry with the following indisputably witty rhetorical exclamation, or, do you think that the knowledge of historical reality is already complete? Or, do you know of any single period in history which is already actually known? 11. Or does critical criticism believe that it has reached even the beginning of a knowledge of historical reality so long as it excludes from the historical movement the theoretical and practical relation of man to nature, i.e., natural science and industry? Or does .it think that it actually knows any period without knowing, for example, the industry of that period, the immediate mode of production of life itself? Of course, spiritualistic, theological critical criticism only knows, at least it imagines it knows, the main political, literary and theological acts of history. Just as it separates thinking from the senses, the soul from the body and itself from the world, it separates history from natural science and industry, and sees the origin of history not in vulgar material production on the earth, but in vaporous clouds in the heavens. The representative of the obdurate and hard-hearted mass with his trench into proofs and counsels is disposed of as a mass-type materialist. Another correspondent, not so malicious or mass-like, who places his hopes in critical criticism but finds them unsatisfied fares no better. The representative of the unsatisfied mass writes, I must, however, admit that the first number of your paper was by no means satisfying. We expected something else. The critical patriarch answers in person, I knew beforehand that it would not satisfy expectations, because I could rather easily imagine those expectations. One is so exhausted that one wishes to have everything at once. Everything. No. If possible everything and nothing at the same time. And everything that costs no trouble, and everything that one can absorb without going through any development, and everything that is contained in a single word. In his vexation at the undue demands of the mass which demands something, indeed everything, from criticism, which by principle and disposition gives nothing, the critical patriarch relates an anecdote in the way that old men do. Not long ago a Berlin acquaintance complained bitterly of the verbosity and profusion of detail of his works. Herr Bruno is known to make a bulky work out of the tiniest semblance of a thought. He was consoled with the promise of being sent the ink necessary for the printing of the book in a small pellet, so that he could easily absorb it. The patriarch explains the length of his works by the bad spreading of the ink, as he explains the nothingness of his literatures and by the emptiness of the profane mass which, in order to be full, wants to swallow everything and nothing at the same time. Just as it is difficult to deny the importance of what has so far been related, it is equally difficult to see a world-historic contradiction in the fact that a mass-type acquaintance of critical criticism considers criticism empty, while criticism, for its part, declares him to be uncritical. That a second acquaintance does not find that the literature's eye-to-wing satisfies his expectations, and that a third acquaintance and friend of the family finds criticism's works too bulky. However, acquaintance no. 2, who entertains expectations, and friend of the family no. 3, who wishes at least to find out the secrets of critical criticism, constitute the transition to a more substantial and tenser relationship between criticism and the uncritical mass. Cruel as criticism is to the hard-hearted mass which has only common human reason, we shall find it condescending to the mass that is pining for redemption from contradiction. The mass which approaches criticism with a contrite heart, a spirit of repentance, and a humble mind will be rewarded for its honest striving with many a wise, prophetic and outspoken word. B. The soft-hearted mass pining for redemption. The representative of the sentimental, soft-hearted mass pining for redemption cringes and implores critical criticism for a kind word with effusions of the heart, deep bows and rolling of the eyes, as follows. Why am I writing this to you? Why am I justifying myself before you? Because I respect you and therefore desire your respect. Because I owe you deepest thanks for my development and therefore love you. My heart impels me to justify myself before you who have upbraided me. Far be it from me to intrude upon you. Judging by myself, I thought you might be pleased to have proof of sympathy from a man who is still little known to you. I make no claim whatsoever that you should answer my letter. I wish neither to take up your time, of which you can make better use, nor to be irksome to you, nor to expose myself to the mortification of seeing something that I hope for remain unfulfilled. You may interpret my letter as sentimentality, importunity or vanity, or whatever you like. You may answer me or not. I cannot resist the impulse to send it, and I'll only hope that you will realize the friendly feeling which inspired it. Just as from the beginning God has had mercy on the poor in spirit, this mass-like but humble correspondent, too, who whimpers for mercy from critical criticism, has his wish fulfilled. Critical criticism gives him a kind answer. More than that, it gives him most profound explanations on the objects of his curiosity. 2 years ago, critical criticism teaches, it was opportune to remember the enlightenment of the French in the 18th century in order to be able to make use of those light troops, too, at a place in the battle that was then being waged. The situation is now quite different. Truths now change very quickly. What was then opportune is now an oversight. Of course it was only an oversight then too, but an opportune one, when the absolute critical all high itself can for anecdota, book 11, called those light troops our saints, our prophets, patriarchs, etc. Who would call light troops a troop of patriarchs? It was an opportune oversight when it spoke with enthusiasm of the self-denial, moral energy and inspiration with which these light troops thought, worked and studied throughout their lives for the truth. It was an oversight when, in the preface to Das Entdeckt Christentum, it was stated that these light troops seemed invincible, and anyone well-informed would have wagered that they would put the world out of joint, and that it seemed beyond doubt that they would succeed in giving the world a new shape. Those light troops. Critical criticism continues to teach the inquisitive representative of the cordial mass. Although it was a new historical merit of the French to attempt to set up a social theory, they are nonetheless now exhausted. Their new theory was not yet pure. Their social fantasies and their peaceful democracy are by no means free from the assumptions of the old state of things. Criticism is talking here about Fourierism is talking about anything and in particular of the Fourierism of la démocratie pacifique. But this is far from being the social theory of the French. The French have social theories, but not a social theory. The diluted Fourierism that la démocratie pacifique preaches is nothing but the social doctrine of a section of the philanthropic bourgeoisie. The people is communistic, and, as a matter of fact, split into a multitude of different groups. The true movement and the elaboration of these different social shades is not if it only not exhausted, it is really only beginning. But it will not end in pure, abstract, theory as critical. Criticism would like it to. It will end in a quite practical practice that will not bother at all about the categorical categories of criticism. No nation, criticism chatters on, has so far any advantage over another. If one can succeed in winning some spiritual superiority over the others, it will be the one which is in a position to criticize itself and the others and to discover the causes of the universal decay. Every nation has so far some advantage over another. But if the critical prophecy is right, no nation will have any advantage over another, because all the civilized peoples of Europe, the English, the Germans, the French now criticize themselves and others and are in a position to discover the causes of the universal decay. Finally, it is high-sounding tautology to say that criticizing, discovering spiritual activities, give spiritual superiority, and criticism, which in its infinite self-consciousness places itself above the nations and expects them to kneel at its feet and implore it for enlightenment, only shows by this caricatured Christian Germanic idealism that it is still up to its neck in the mire of German nationalism. The criticism of the French and the English is not an abstract, preternatural personality outside mankind. It is the real human activity of individuals who are active members of society and who suffer, feel, think and act as human beings. That is why their criticism is at the same time practical, their communism a socialism in which they give practical, concrete measures, and in which they not only think but even more act. It is the living, real criticism of existing society, the recognition of the causes of the decay. After critical criticism's explanations for the inquisitive member of the mass, it is entitled to say of its literators I too in here criticism that is pure, graphic, relevant and adds nothing is practiced. Here nothing self-existing is given. Here nothing at all is given except criticism that gives nothing. That is criticism which culminates in extreme non-criticism. Criticism has underlined passages printed and reaches its full bloom in excerpts. Wolfgang Menzel and Bruno Bauer stretch a brotherly hand to each other and critical criticism stands where the philosophy of identity stood at the beginning of this century, when Schelling protested against the mass-like supposition that he wanted to give something, anything except pure, entirely philosophical philosophy. See, grace bestowed on the mass the soft-hearted correspondent, whose instruction we have just witnessed stood in a comfortable relationship to criticism. In his case there was only an idyllic hint of the tension between the mass and criticism. Both sides of the world historic contradiction behaved kindly and politely, and therefore exoterically, to each other. Critical criticism, in its unhealthy, soul-shattering effect on the mass, is seen first in regard to a correspondent who has one foot already in criticism and the other still in the profane world. He represents the mass in its inner struggle with criticism. At times it seems to him that Herr Bruno and his friends do not understand mankind, that they are the ones who are really blinded. Then he immediately corrects himself. Yes, it is as clear as daylight to me that you are right and that your thoughts are correct, but excuse me, the people is not wrong either. Oh yes, the people is right. I cannot deny that you are right. I really do not know what it will all lead to, you will say. Well, stay at home. Alas, I can no longer stand it. Alas, one might otherwise go mad in the end. Kindly accept. Believe me, the knowledge one has acquired sometimes makes one feel as stupid as if a mill wheel were turning in one's head. Another correspondent, too, writes that he occasionally disconcerted. One can see that critical grace is about to be bestowed on this mass-type correspondent. The poor wretch. The sinful mass is tugging at him on one side and critical criticism on the other. It is not the knowledge he has acquired that reduces this pupil of critical criticism to a state of stupor. It is the question of faith and conscience. Critical Christ or the people, God or the world, Bruno Bauer and his friends or the profane mass. But just as best hour of divine grace is preceded by extreme wretchedness of the sinner, critical grace is preceded by crushing stupefaction. And when it is at last bestowed, the chosen one loses not stupidity but the consciousness of stupidity. 3. The uncritically critical mass or criticism and the Berlin Kohler critical criticism has not succeeded in depicting itself as the essential opposite, and hence at the same time as the essential object, of the mass of humanity. Apart from the representatives of the obdurate mass which reproaches critical criticism for its objectlessness and gives it to understand in the most courteous possible way that it has not yet gone through the process of its spiritual mold and must first of all acquire solid knowledge, there is the soft-hearted correspondent. He is no opposite at all, but then the actual reason for his approach to critical criticism is a purely personal one. As we can see a little further on in his letter, he really only wants to reconcile his devotion to Herr Arnold Ruge with his devotion to Herr Bruno Bauer. This attempt at reconciliation does credit to his kind heart, but it in no way constitutes an interest of a mass nature. Finally, the last correspondent to appear was no longer a real member of the mass, he was only a catechumen of critical criticism. In general, the mass is an indefinite object, and therefore can neither carry out a definite action nor enter into a definite relationship. The mass, as the object of critical criticism, has nothing in common with the real masses who, for their part, form among themselves oppositions of a pronounced mass nature. Critical criticism's mass is made by criticism itself, as would be the case if a naturalist, instead of speaking of definite classes, contrasted the class to himself. Hence, in order to have an opposite of a really mass nature, critical criticism needs, besides this abstract mass which is the figment of its own brain, a definite mass that can be empirically demonstrated and not just conjured up. This mass must see in critical criticism both its essence and the annihilation of its essence. It must wish to be critical criticism, non-mass, without being able to. This critically uncritical mass is the above-mentioned Berlin Kohler. The mass of humanity which is seriously concerned with critical criticism is confined to a Berlin Kohler. The Berlin Kohler, the essential object of critical criticism, of which it is always thinking and which critical criticism imagines, is always thinking of critical criticism, consists, as far as we know, of a few ci-devant young Hegelians in whom critical criticism claims to inspire partly a horror vacui and partly a feeling of futility. We are not investigating the actual state of affairs, we rely on what criticism says. The correspondence is mainly intended to expound at length to the public this world-historic relation of criticism to the Berlin Kohler, to reveal its profound significance, to show why criticism must necessarily be cruel towards this mass, and finally to make it appear that the whole world is in fearful agitation over this opposition, expressing itself now in favor of, and then against the actions of criticism. For example, absolute criticism writes to a correspondent who sides with the Berlin Kohler, "I have already heard things like that so often that I have made up my mind not to take any more notice of them." The world has no idea how often it has dealt with critical things like that. Let us now hear what a member of the critical mass reports on the Berlin Kohler. "If anyone recognizes the Bauers, the Holy Family must always be recognized." Pele Meal began his answer LM the one. "But the Literature Zeitung. Let us be quite fair, it was interesting for me to hear what one of those radicals, those clever men of Anno 42, thought of you." The correspondent goes on to record that the unfortunate man had all sorts of reproaches to make to the Literature Zeitung. Herr Edgar's short story, Die drei Biedermdner, he found lacking in polish and exaggerated. He could not understand that censorship is not so much a fight of man against man, an external fight, as an internal one. They do not take the trouble to bethink themselves and to replace the phrase the censor objects to by a cleverly expressed and thoroughly developed critical thought. He found Herr Edgar's essay on Bayreuth Lee lacking in thoroughness. The critical reporter thinks it was thorough. True, he admitted himself, "I have not read Bayreuth's book." But he believes that Herr Edgar has succeeded, etc., and belief, we know, is BHSSIN. General. The critical believer continues, he, the one from the Berlin Kohler, is not at all satisfied with Herr Edgar's works. He also finds that Proudhon is not dealt with thoroughly enough, and here the reporter gives Herr Edgar a testimonial. "It is true, 7. That I'm acquainted with Proudhon. I know that Edgar's presentation took the characteristic points from him and set them out clearly. The only reason why Herr Edgar's excellent criticism of Proudhon is not liked," the reporter says, "can only be that Herr Edgar does not fulminate against property. And just imagine it, the opponent finds Herr Edgar's essay on the Union Ouvrière unimportant." To console Herr Edgar, the reporter says, "Of course, it does not give anything independent, and these people have really gone back to Grupp's point of view, which, to be sure, they have always maintained. Criticism must give and give as though criticism had not given quite new linguistic, historical, philosophical, economic, and juridical discoveries, and it is so modest as to let itself be told that it has not given anything independent. Even our critical correspondent gave mechanics something that it had not hitherto known when he made people go back to the same point of view which they had always maintained. It is clumsy to recall Grupp's point of view. In his pamphlet, which is otherwise miserable and not worth mentioning, Grupp asked Herr Bruno what criticism he could give on speculative logic. Herr Bruno referred him to future generations, and a fool is waiting for an answer, as God punished the unbelieving Pharaoh by hardening his heart and did not think him worthy of being enlightened. So the reporter assures us, they are therefore not at all worthy of seeing or knowing the contents of your Literature Zeitung. And instead of advising his friend Edgar to acquire thoughts and knowledge, he gives him the following advice: let Edgar get a bag of phrases and draw blindly out of it when he writes essays in future, in order to acquire a style in harmony with the public. Besides assurances of a certain fury, ill favor, emptiness, thoughtlessness, an inkling of something which they are not able to fathom, and a feeling of nullity, all these epithets apply, of course, to the Berlin Kohler. Eulogies like the following are made of the Holy Family: lightness of treatment penetrating the matter, command of the categories, insight acquired by study, in a word, command of the objects. He, of the Berlin Kohler, takes an easy attitude to the thing, you make the thing easy. Or, your criticism in the Literature Zeitung is pure, graphic and relevant. Finally it is stated, I have written it all to you at such length, because I know that I shall give you pleasure by reporting the opinions of my friend. From this you can see that the Literature Zeitung is fulfilling its purpose. Its purpose is opposition to the Berlin Kohler. Having just witnessed the Berlin Kohler's polemic against critical criticism and the reproof it received for that polemic, we are now given a double picture of its efforts to obtain mercy from critical criticism. One correspondent writes, my acquaintances in Berlin told me when I was there at the beginning of the year that you repel all and keep all at a distance, that you keep yourself to yourself and let nobody approach you, assiduously avoiding all intercourse. One, of course, cannot tell which side is to blame. Absolute criticism replies, criticism does not form any party and will have no party of its own. It is solitary because it is engrossed in its I object and opposes itself to it. It isolates itself from everything. Critical criticism thinks it rises above all dogmatic antitheses by substituting for the real antitheses the imaginary antithesis between itself and the world, between the Holy Ghost and the profane mass in the same way it thinks it rises above parties by falling below the party point of view, by counterposing itself as a party to the rest of mankind, and concentrating all interest in the personality of Herr Bruno and company. The truth of criticism's admission that it sits enthroned in the solitude of abstraction, that even when it seems to be occupied with some object it does not come out of its objectless solitude into a truly social relation to a real object, because its object is only the object of its imagination, only an imaginary object. The truth of this critical admission is proved by the whole of our exposition. Equally correctly, criticism defines its abstraction as absolute abstraction, in the sense that it isolates itself from everything, and precisely this isolation of nothing from everything, from all thought, contemplation, etc., is absolute nonsense. Incidentally, the solitude which it achieves by isolating and abstracting itself from everything is no more free from the object from which it abstracts itself than Origen was from the genital organ that he isolated from himself. Another correspondent begins by describing one of the members of the Berlin Choir whom he saw and spoke with, as gloomy, depressed, no longer able to open his mouth, although he was formerly always ready with a quite impudent word, and despondent. This member of the Berlin Choir related the following to the correspondent, who in turn reported it to criticism. He cannot grasp how people like you two, who formerly respected the principle of humanity, can behave in such an aloof, repelling, indeed arrogant manner. He does not know why there are some people who, it seems, intentionally cause a split. Have we not all the same point of view? Do we not all pay homage to the extreme, to criticism? Are we not all capable, if not of producing, at least of grasping and applying an extreme thought? 11. He finds that this split is motivated by no other principle than egoism and arrogance. Then the correspondent puts in a good word. Have not at least some of our friends grasped criticism, or perhaps the goodwill of criticism ut sint vires, tamen est lodandi voluntas? Criticism replies with the following antitheses between itself and the Berlin Choir. There are various standpoints on criticism. The members of the Berlin Choir thought they had criticism in their pocket, but criticism really knows and applies the force of criticism. I.e. does not keep .it in its pocket. For the former, criticism is pure form, whereas for criticism, on the other hand, it is the most substantial, or rather the only substantial thing. Just as absolute thought considers itself the whole of reality, so does critical criticism. That is why it sees no content outside itself and is therefore not the criticism of real objects existing outside the critical subject. On the contrary, it makes the object. It is the absolute subject. Object. Further, the former kind of criticism disposes of everything, of the investigation of things, by means of phrases. The latter isolates itself from everything by means of phrases. The former is clever in ignorance, the latter is learning. The latter, at any rate, is not clever. It learns parla, but only in appearance, only in order to be able to fling what it has superficially learned from the mass back at the mass in the form of a catchword, as wisdom that it itself has discovered, and to resolve it into the nonsense of critical criticism. For the former, words such as extreme, proceed, not go far enough, are of importance and highly revered categories. The latter investigates the standpoints and does not apply to them the measures of those abstract categories. The exclamations of criticism know to that it is no longer a question of politics, that philosophy is done away with, and its dismissal of social systems and developments by means of words like fantastic, utopian, etc. What is all that if not a critically revised version of proceeding and not going far enough? And are not its measures, such as history, criticism, summing up of objects, the old and criticism and mass investigation of standpoints in a word, are not all its catchwords categorical measures and abstractly categorical ones at that? The new. The former is theological, spiteful, envious, petty, presumptuous. The latter is the opposite of all that. After thus praising itself a dozen times in one breath and ascribing to itself all that the Berlin Choir lacks, just as God is all that man is not, criticism bears witness to itself that it has achieved a clarity, a thirst for learning, a tranquility in which it is unassailable and invincible. Hence it can at the most treat its opponent, the Berlin Choir, with Olympic laughter. This laughter it explains with its customary thoroughness what it is and what it is not. This laughter is not arrogance, by no means. It is the negation of the negation. It is only the process that the critic must apply in all ease and equanimity against a subordinate standpoint which thinks itself equal to him. What conceit! When the critic laughs, therefore, he is applying a processal, and in all equanimity he applies the process of laughter not against persons, but against a standpoint. Even laughter is a category which he applies and even must apply. Extreme and vain criticism is not an essential activity of the human subject who is real, and therefore lives and suffers in present-day society, sharing in its pains and pleasures. The real individual is only an accidental feature, an earthly vessel of critical criticism, which reveals itself in it as eternal substance. The subject is not the human individual's criticism, but the non-human individual of criticism. Criticism is not a manifestation of man, but man is an alienation of criticism, and that is why the critic lives completely outside society. Can the critic live in the society which he criticizes? 11. It should be asked instead, must he not live in that society? Must he not himself be a manifestation of the life of that society? Why does the critic sell the products of his mind, for thereby he makes the worst law of present-day society his own law? The critic must not even dare to mix personally with society. That is why he creates for himself a holy family, just as the solitary God endeavors in the holy family to end his tedious isolation from society. If the critic wants to free himself from bad society, he must first of all free himself from his own society. Thus the critic dispenses with all the pleasures of society, but its sufferings, too, stay remote from him. He knows neither friendship, except that of critical friends, nor love, except self-love, but on the other hand calumny is powerless against him. Nothing can offend him. No hatred, no envy can affect him. Vexation and grief are feelings unknown to him. In short, the critic is free from all human passions. He is a divine person. He can apply to himself the song of the nun. I think not of a lover, I think not of a spouse. I think of God the Father, for he my life endows. Criticism cannot write a single passage without contradicting itself. Thus it tells us finally, the Philistinism that stones the critic, he has to be stoned by analogy with the Bible, that misjudges him and ascribes impure motives to him, ascribes impure motives to pure criticism. In order to make him equal to itself, the conceit of equality reproved above is not laughed at by him, because it is not worth it, but is seen through and calmly recusated to its own insignificant significance. Earlier the critic had to apply the process of laughter to the subordinate standpoint that thought itself equal to him. Critical criticism's unclarity about its mode of procedure with the godless mass seems almost to indicate an interior irritation, a sort of bile to which feelings are not unknown. However, there should be no misunderstanding. Having waged a Herculean struggle to free itself from the uncritical profane mass and everything, critical criticism has at last succeeded in achieving its solitary, godlike, self-sufficient, absolute existence. If in its first pronouncement in this, its new phase, the old world of sinful feelings seems still to have some power over it, we shall now see criticism find aesthetic relaxation and transfiguration in an artistic form and complete its penance, so it can finally as a second triumphant Christ accomplish the critical last judgment, and after its victory over the dragon ascend calmly to heaven. Chapter VLLL. The earthly course and transfiguration of critical criticism, or critical criticism, as Rudolf, Prince of Gerolstein, does penance in his earthly course for a double crime, his personal crime and that of critical criticism. In a furious dialogue he drew his sword against his father. Critical criticism, also in a furious dialogue, let itself be carried away by sinful feelings against the mass. Critical criticism did not reveal a single mystery. Rudolf does penance for that and reveals all mysteries. Rudolf, Herrscheliga informs us, is the first servant of the state of humanity. For the world not to be destroyed, Herrscheliga asserts, it is necessary that men of ruthless criticism appear. Rudolf is such. Amen. Rudolf grasps the thought of pure criticism. And that thought is more fruitful for him and mankind than all the experiences of the latter in its history, than all the knowledge that Rudolf, guided even by the most reliable teacher, was able to derive from that history. The impartial judgment by which Rudolf perpetuates his earthly course is, in fact, nothing but the revelation of the mysteries of society. He is the revealed mystery of all mysteries. Rudolf has far more external means at his disposal than the other men of critical criticism. But the latter consoles itself, unattainable for those less favored by destiny are Rudolf's results. Not unattainable is the splendid goal. That is why criticism leaves the realization of its own thoughts to Rudolf, who is so favored by destiny. It sings to him, Hainman, go on ahead. You've waded on, you won't get wet. Let us accompany Rudolf in his critical earthly course, which is more fruitful for mankind than all the experiences of the latter in its history, than all the knowledge, etc., and which twice saves the world from destruction. 1. Critical transformation of a butcher into a dog, or Ch8-9. Ch8-9 was a butcher by trade. Owing to a concourse of circumstances, this mighty son of nature becomes a murderer. Rudolf comes across him accidentally just when he is molesting Flirty Marie. Rudolf gives the dexterous brawler a few impressive, masterly punches on the head, and thus wins his respect. Later, in the tavern frequented by criminals, Ch8-9's kind-hearted disposition is revealed. You still have heart and honor, Rudolf says to him. By these words he instills in Ch8-9 respect for himself. Ch8-9 is reformed, or, as Herrscheliga says, is transformed into a moral being. Rudolf takes him under his protection. Let us follow the course of Ch8-9's education under the guidance of Rudolf. First stage. The first lesson Ch8-9 receives is a lesson in hypocrisy, faithlessness, craft and dissimulation. Rudolf uses the reformed Ch8-9 in exactly the same way as Vedic used the criminals he had reformed, i.e., he makes him a mouchard and agent provocateur. He advises him to pretend to the maitre d'ecole that he has altered his principle of not stealing and to suggest a robbery so as to lure him into a trap set by Rudolf. Ch8-9 feels that he is being made a fool of. He protests against the suggestion of playing the role of mouchard and agent provocateur. Rudolf easily convinces the son of nature by the pure casuistry of critical criticism that a foul trick is not foul when it is done for good, moral reasons. Ch8-9, as an agent provocateur and under the pretense of friendship and confidence, lures his former companion to destruction. For the first time in his life he commits an act of infamy. Second stage. We next find Ch8-9 acting as guard-malade to Rudolf, whom he has saved from mortal danger. Ch8-9 has become such a respectable moral being that he rejects the Negro Dr. David's suggestion to sit on the floor, for fear of dirtying the carpet. He is indeed too shy to sit on a chair. He first lays the chair on its back and then sits on the front legs. He never fails to apologize when he addresses Rudolf, whom he saved from a mortal danger, as friend or Monsieur, instead of Monsignor. What a wonderful training of the ruthless son of nature. Ch8-9 expresses the innermost secret of his critical transformation when he admits to Rudolf that he has the same attachment for him as a bulldog for its master. Je me sens pour vous, comme cuiderate I attach aiment d'une boule dog pour son maître. The former butcher is transformed into a dog. Henceforth all his virtues will be reduced to the virtue of a dog, pure devoutment to its master. His independence, his individuality will disappear completely. But just as bad painters have to label their pictures to say what they are supposed to represent, Oigensu has to put a label on Bulldog Ch8-9, who constantly affirms the two words, "You still have heart and honor, made a man out of me." Until his very last breath, Ch8-9 will find the motive for his actions, not in his human individuality, but in that label. As proof of his moral reformation he will often reflect on his own excellence and the wickedness of other individuals. And every time he throws out moral sentences, Rudolph will say to him, "I like to hear you speak like that." Ch8-9 has not become an ordinary bulldog but a moral one. Third stage. We have already admired the petty bourgeois respectability which has taken the place of Ch8-9's coarse but daring unceremoniousness. We now learn that, as befits a moral being, he has also adopted the gait and demeanor of the petty bourgeois. Au revoir marcher, on ayut pris pour le bourgeois plus inoffensif du monde. Still sadder than this form is the content that Rudolph gives his critically reformed life. He sends him to Africa to serve as a living and salutary example of repentance to the world of unbelievers. In future, he will have to represent, not his own human nature, but a Christian dogma. Fourth stage. The critically moral transformation has made Ch8-9 a quiet, cautious man who behaves according to the rules of fair and worldly wisdom. The Ch8-9 reports Murph, who in his indiscreet simplicity continually tells tales out of school and applaudit unmit the execution du maître d'école, deeper de se trouver compromise, so Ch8-9 knows that the punishment of the maître d'école was an illegal act. But he does not talk about it for fear of compromising himself. Why is Ch8-9 fifth stage? Ch8-9 has carried his moral education to such perfection that he gives his dog-like attitude to Rudolph a civilized form. He becomes conscious of it. After saving Germain from a mortal danger he says to him, "I have a protector who is to me what God is to priests. He is such as to make one kneel before him." And in imagination he kneels before his God. "Monsieur Rudolph," he says to Germain, "protects you." I say, "Monsieur," though I should say, "Monsignor." But I'm used to calling him Monsieur Rudolph, and he allows me to. Magnificent awakening and flowering. 111 exclaims Ch8-9 in critical delight. Sixth stage. Ch8-9 worthily ends his career of pure devoutment, or moral bulldoggishness, by finally letting himself be stabbed to death for his gracious lord. At the moment when Sklet threatens the prince with his knife, Ch8-9 stays the murderer's arm. Sklet stabs him but, dying, Ch8-9 says to Rudolph, "I was right when I said that a lump of earth, a bulldog like me, can sometimes be useful to a great and gracious master like you." To this dog-like utterance, which sums up the whole of Ch8-9's critical life like an epigram, the label put in his mouth adds, "We are quits, Monsieur Rudolph. You told me that I had heart and honor." Herr Ch8-9 cries as loud as he can, what a merit it was for Rudolph to have restored the Schumann to mankind. 2. Revelation of the mystery of critical religion, or Fleur-de-Marie. The speculative Marguerite. A word more about Herr Ch8-9's speculative Marguerite before we go on to Oigensu's Fleur-de-Marie. The speculative Marguerite is above all a correction. The fact is that the reader could conclude from Herr Ch8-9's construction that Oigensu had separated the presentation of the objective basis of the world system from the development of the acting individual forces which can be understood only against that background. Besides the task of correcting this erroneous conjecture that the reader may have made from Herr Ch8-9's presentation, Marguerite has also a metaphysical mission in our, or rather Herr Ch8-9's, epic. The world system and an epic event would still not be artistically united in a really single whole if they were only interspersed in a motley mixture. Now here a bit of world system and then there's some stage play. If real unity is to result, both things, the mysteries of this prejudiced world and the clarity, frankness and confidence with which Rudolph penetrates and reveals them, must clash in a single individual. This is the task of Marguerite. Herr Ch8-9 speculatively constructs Marguerite by analogy with Bauer's construction of the Mother of God. On one side is the divine element, Rudolph, to which all power and freedom are attributed, the only active principle. On the other side is the passive world system and the human beings belonging to it. The world system is the ground of reality. If this ground is not to be entirely abandoned, or the last remnant of the natural condition is not to be abolished, if the world itself is to have some share in the principle of development that Rudolph, in contrast to the world, concentrates in himself, if the human element is not to be represented simply as unfree and inactive, Herr Ch8-9 is bound to fall into the contradiction of religious consciousness. Although he tears apart the world system and its activity as the dualism of a dead mass and criticism, Rudolph, he is nevertheless obliged to concede some attributes of divinity to the world system and the mass, and to give in Marguerite a speculative construction of the unity of the two, Rudolph and the world. See Critique der Synoptiker, band. Besides the real relations of the house owner, the acting individual force, to his house, the objective basis, mystical speculation, and speculative aesthetics too, need a third concrete, speculative unity, a subject-object which is the house and the house owner in one. As speculation does not like natural mediations in their extensive circumstantiality, it does not realize that the same bit of world system, the house, for example, which for one, the house owner, for example, is an objective basis, is for the other, the builder of the house, an epic event. In order to get a really single whole and real unity, critical criticism, which reproaches romantic art with the dogma of unity, replaces the natural and human connection between the world system and world events by a fantastic connection, a mystical subject-object, just as Hegel replaces the real connection between man and nature by an absolute subject-object which is at one and the same time the whole of nature and the whole of humanity, the absolute spirit. In the critical Marguerite, the universal guilt of the time, the guilt of mystery, becomes the mystery of guilt, just as the universal debt of mystery becomes the mystery of debts in the indebted Apicier. according to the Mother of God construction, Marguerite should really have been the mother of Rudolf, the Redeemer of the world. Herschel expressly says, according to the logical sequence, Rudolf should have been the son of Marguerite. Since, however, he is not her son, but her father, Herschel finds in this the new mystery that the present often bears in its womb the long-departed past instead of the future. He even reveals another mystery, a still greater one, a mystery which directly contradicts mass-type statistics, the mystery that a child, if it does not, in its turn, become a father or mother, but goes to its grave pure and innocent, is, essentially, a daughter. Herschel faithfully follows Hegel's speculation when, according to the logical sequence, he regards the daughter as the mother of her father. In Hegel's philosophy of history, as in his philosophy of nature, the son engenders the mother, the spirit nature, the Christian religion paganism, the result the beginning. After proving that according to the logical sequence, Marguerite ought to have been Rudolf's mother, Herschel proves the opposite. In order to conform fully to the idea she embodies in our epic, she must never become a mother. This shows at least that the idea of our epic and Herschel's logical sequence are mutually contradictory. The speculative Marguerite is nothing but the embodiment of an idea. But what idea? She has the task of representing, as it were, the last tear of grief that the past sheds prior to its final passing away. She is the representation of an allegorical tear, and even this little that she is only as it were. We shall not follow Herschel in his further description of Marguerite. We shall leave her the satisfaction, according to Herschel's prescription, of constituting the most decisive antithesis to every one, a mysterious antithesis, as mysterious as the attributes of God. Neither shall we delve into the true mystery that is deposited by God in the breast of man, and at which the speculative Marguerite as it were hints. We shall pass from Herschel's Marguerite to Eugensu's Fleur de Marie, and to the critical miraculous cures Rudolf accomplishes on her. B. Fleur de Marie. We meet Marie surrounded by criminals, as a prostitute in bondage to the proprietress of the criminals' tavern. In this debasement she preserves a human nobleness of soul, a human unaffectedness, and a human beauty that impress those around her, raise her to the level of a poetical flower of the criminal world, and win for her the name of Fleur de Marie. We must observe Fleur de Marie attentively from her first appearance in order to be able to compare her original form with her critical transformation. In spite of her frailty, Fleur de Marie at once gives proof of vitality, energy, cheerfulness, resilience of character qualities which alone explain her human development in her inhuman situation. When Ch8-9 ill-treats her, she defends herself with her scissors. That is the situation in which we first find her. She does not appear as a defenseless lamb who surrenders without any resistance to overwhelming brutality. She is a girl who can vindicate her rights and put up a fight. In the criminals' tavern in the Rue aux Fèves she tells Ch8-9 and Rudolf the story of her life. As she does so she laughs at Ch8-9's wit. She blames herself because on being released from prison she spent the 300 francs she had earned there on amusements instead of looking for work. But, she said, I had no one to advise me. The memory of the catastrophe of her life her selling herself to the proprietress of the criminals' tavern puts her in a melancholy mood. It is the first time since her childhood that she has recalled these events. The fatest, que me chagrin de regarder ainsi derrière moi adult et her bien bon d'être honnête. When Ch8-9 makes fun of her and tells her she must become honest, she exclaims, honnête, mon Dieu. Et avec quoi donc vous tout que je sois honnête? 11. She insists that she is not one to have fits of tears, je ne suis pas pleureuse, but her position in life is sad, que n'est-ce pas gay? Finally, contrary to Christian repentance, she pronounces on the past a human sentence, at once stoic and epicurean, of a free and strong nature, enfim si qui est fate. Let us accompany Fleur de Marie on her first outing with Rudolf. The consciousness of your terrible situation has probably often distressed you, Rudolf says, itching to moralize. Yes, she replies, more than once I looked over the embankment of the Seine, but then I would gaze at the flowers and the sun and say to myself, the river will always be there, and I am not yet 17 years old. Who can say? On such occasions it seemed to me that I had not deserved my fate, that I had something good in me. People have tormented me enough, I used to say to myself, but at least I have never done any harm to anyone. Fleur de Marie considers her situation not as one she has freely created, not as the expression of her own personality, but as a fate she has not deserved. Her bad fortune can change. She is still young. Good and evil, as Marie conceives them, are not the moral abstractions of good and evil. She is good because she has never caused suffering to anyone, she has always been human towards her inhuman surroundings. She is good because the sun and the flowers reveal to her own sunny and blossoming nature. She is good because she is still young, full of hope and vitality. Her situation is not good, because it puts an unnatural constraint on her, because it is not the expression of her human impulses, not the fulfillment of her human desires, because it is full of torment and without joy. She measures her situation in life by her own individuality, her essential nature, not by the ideal of what is good. In natural surroundings, where the chains of bourgeois life fall away and she can freely manifest her own nature, Fleur de Marie bubbles over with love of life, with a wealth of feeling, with human joy at the beauty of nature. These show that her social position has only grazed the surface of her and is a mere misfortune, that she herself is neither good nor bad, but human. Monsieur Rudolph, what happy nisel grass, field sill if you would allow me to get out, the weather is so fine. Should love so much to run about in these meadows. Alighting from the carriage, she plucks flowers for Rudolph, can hardly speak for joy, etc., etc. Rudolph tells her that he is going to take her to Madame Georgette's farm. There she can see dovecotes, cow stalls and so forth. There they have milk, butter, fruit, etc. Those are real blessings for this child. She will be merry. That is her main thought. You can't believe how well I'm longing for some funnel, she explains to Rudolph in the most unaffected way her own share of responsibility for her misfortune. My whole fate is due to the fact that I did not save up my money. She therefore advises him to be thrifty and to put money in the savings bank. Her fancy runs wild in the castles in the air that Rudolph builds for her. She becomes sad only because she has forgotten the present, and the contrast of that present with the dream of a joyous and laughing existence reminds her of the cruelty of her situation. So far we have seen Flirty Marie in her original uncritical form. Eugensu has risen above the horizon of his narrow world outlook. He has slapped bourgeois prejudice in the face. He will hand over Flirty Marie to the hero Rudolph to atone for his temerity and to reap applause from all old men and women, from the whole of the Paris police, from the current religion, and from critical criticism. Madame George, to whom Rudolph entrusts Flirty Marie, is an unhappy, hypochondriacal religious woman. She immediately welcomes the child with the unctuous words, God blesses those who love and fear him, who have been unhappy and who repent. Rudolph, the man of pure criticism, has the wretched priest Laporte, whose hair has grayed in superstition, called in. He has the mission of accomplishing Flirty Marie's critical reform. Joyfully and unaffectedly Marie approaches the old priest. In his Christian brutality, Eugensu makes a marvelous instinct at once whisper in her ear that shame ends where repentance and penance begin, that is, in the church, which alone saves. He forgets the unconstrained merriness of the outing, a merriness which nature's grace and Rudolph's friendly sympathy had produced, and which was troubled only by the thought of having to go back to the criminal's landlady. The priest Laporte immediately adopts supermundane attitude. His first words are, God's mercy is infinite, my dear child. He has proved it to you by not abandoning you in your severe trials. The magnanimous man who saved you fulfilled the word of the Scriptures. Note the word of the Scriptures, not a human purpose. Verily the Lord is nigh to those who invoke him. He will fulfill their desires, he will hear their voice, and will save them. The Lord will accomplish his work. Marie cannot yet understand the evil meaning of the priest's exhortations. She answers, I shall pray for those who pitied me and brought me back to God. Her first thought is not for God, it is for her human savior, and she wants to pray for him, not for her own absolution. She attributes to her prayer some influence on the salvation of others. Indeed, she is still so naive that she supposes she has already been brought back to God. The priest feels it is his duty to destroy this unorthodox illusion. Soon, he says, interrupting her, soon you will deserve absolution, absolution from your great errors. For, to quote the prophet once more, the Lord holdeth up those who are on the brink of falling. One should not fail to see the inhuman expressions the priest uses. Soon you will deserve absolution, your sins are not yet forgiven. As Laporte, when he receives the girl, bestows on her the consciousness of her sins, so Rudolph, when he leaves her, presents her with a gold cross, the symbol of the Christian crucifixion awaiting her. Marie has already been living for some time on Madame George's farm. Let us first listen to a dialogue between the old priest Laporte and Madame George. He considers marriage out of the question for Marie because no man, in spite of the priest's guarantee, will have the courage to face the past that has soiled her youth. He adds, she has great errors to atone for, her moral sense ought to have kept her upright. He proves, as the commonest of bourgeois would, that she could have remained good. There are many virtuous people in Paris today. The hypocritical priest knows quite well that at any hour of the day, in the busiest streets, those virtuous people of Paris pass indifferently by little girls of 7 or 8 years who sell allumettes, and the like until about midnight, as Marie herself used to do, and who, almost without exception, will have the same fate as Marie. The priest has made up his mind concerning Marie's penance. In his own mind he has already condemned her. Let us follow Marie when she is accompanying Laporte home in the evening. See, my child, he begins with unctuous eloquence, the boundless horizon, the limits of which are no longer visible, for it is evening. It seems to me that the calm and the vastness almost give us an idea of eternity. I'm telling you this, Marie, because you are sensitive to the beauties of creation. I have often been moved by the religious admiration which they inspire in you who for so long were deprived of religious feeling. The priest has already succeeded in changing Marie's immediate naive pleasure in the beauties of nature into a religious admiration. For her, nature has already become devout, Christianized nature, debased to creation. The transparency of space is desecrated and turned into the dark symbol of stagnant eternity. She has already learnt that all human manifestations of her being were profane, devoid of religion, of real consecration, that they were impious and godless. The priest must soil her in her own eyes, he must trample underfoot her natural, spiritual resources and means of grace, in order to make her receptive to the supernatural means of grace he promises her, baptism. When Marie wants to make a confession to him and asks him to be lenient, he answers, the Lord has shown you that he is merciful. In the clemency which she is shown, Marie must not see a natural, self-evident attitude of a related human being to her, another human being. She must see in it an extravagant, supernatural, superhuman mercy and condescension. In human leniency she must see divine mercy. She must transcendentalize all human and natural relationships by making them relationships to God. The way Flirty Marie in her answer accepts the priest's chatter about divine mercy shows how far she has already been spoilt by religious doctrine. As soon as she entered upon her improved situation, she said, she had felt only her new happiness. Every instant I thought of Monsieur Rudolph. I often raised my eyes to heaven, to look there, not for God, but for Monsieur Rudolph, and to thank him. Yes, I confess, Father, I thought more of him than of God, for he did for me what God alone could have done. I was happy, happy as someone who has escaped a great danger forever. Flirty Marie already finds it wrong that she took a new happy situation in life simply for what it really was, that she felt it as a new happiness, that her attitude to it was a natural, not a supernatural one. She accuses herself of seeing in the man who rescued her what he really was, her rescuer, instead of supposing some imaginary savior, God, in his place. She is already caught in religious hypocrisy, which takes away from another man what he has deserved in respect of me in order to give it to God, and which in general regards everything human in man as alien to him and everything inhuman in him as really belonging to him. Marie tells us that the religious transformation of her thoughts, her sentiments, her attitude to life was effected by Madame George and Laporte. When Rudolph took me away from the site, I already had a vague consciousness of my degradation. But the education, the advice and examples I got from you and Madame George made me understand that I had been more guilty than unfortunate. You and Madame George made me realize the infinite depth of my damnation. That is to say, she owes to the priest Laporte and Madame George the replacement of the human and therefore bearable consciousness of her degradation by the Christian and hence unbearable consciousness of eternal damnation. The priest and the bigot have taught her to judge herself from the Christian point of view. Marie feels the depth of the spiritual misfortune into which she has been cast. She says, since the consciousness of good and evil had to be so frightful for me, why was I not left to my wretched lot? Had I not been snatched away from infamy, misery and blows would soon have killed me. At least I should have died in ignorance of a purity that I shall always wish for in vain. The heartless priest replies, even the most noble nature, were it to be plunged only for a day in the filth from which you have been saved, would be indelibly branded. That is the immutability of divine justice. 11. Deeply wounded by this priestly curse uttered in such honeyed tones, Flirty Marie exclaims, you see therefore, I must despair. 11. The grey-headed slave of religion answers, you must renounce hope of effacing this desolate page from your life, but you must trust in the infinite mercy of God. Here below, my poor child, you will have tears, remorse and penance, but one day up above, forgiveness and eternal bliss. Marie is not yet stupid enough to be satisfied with eternal bliss and forgiveness up above. Pity, pity, my God, she cries. Elle am so young. Malheur-moi. 11. Then the hypocritical sophistry of the priest reaches its peak. On the contrary, happiness for you, Marie, happiness for you to whom the Lord sends this bitter but saving remorse. It shows the religious susceptibility of your soul. Each of your sufferings is counted above. Believe me, God left you a while on the path of evil only to reserve for you the glory of repentance and the eternal reward due to atonement. From this moment Marie is enslaved by the consciousness of sin. In her former most unhappy situation in life she was able to develop a lovable, human individuality. In her outward debasement she was conscious that her human essence was her true essence. Now the filth of modern society, which has touched her externally, becomes her innermost being, and continual hypochondriacal self-torture because of that filth becomes her duty, the task of her life appointed by God himself, the self-purpose of her existence. Formerly she said of herself, je ne suis popularnicus, and knew that si qui est fate. Now self-torment will be her good and remorse will be her glory. It turns out later that Flirty Marie is Rudolph's daughter. We come across her again as Princess of Gerolstein. We overhear a conversation she has with her father. In vain I pray to God to deliver me from these obsessions, to fill my heart solely with his pious love and his holy hopes, in a word, to take me entirely, because I wish to give myself entirely to him. He does not grant my wishes, doubtless because my earthly preoccupations make me unworthy of communion with him. When man has realized that his transgressions are infinite crimes against God, he can be sure of salvation and mercy only if he gives himself wholly to God and becomes wholly dead to the world and worldly concerns. When Flirty Marie realizes that her delivery from her inhuman situation in life was a miracle of God, she herself has to become a saint in order to be worthy of such a miracle. Her human love must be transformed into religious love, the striving for happiness into striving for eternal bliss, worldly satisfaction into holy hope, communion with people into communion with God. God must take her entirely. She herself reveals to us why he does not take her entirely. She has not yet given herself entirely to him. Her heart is still preoccupied and engaged with earthly affairs. This is the last flickering of her strong nature. She gives herself entirely up to God by becoming wholly dead to the world and entering a convent. A monastery is no place for him who has no stock of sins laid in, so numerous and great that be it early, be it late, he may not miss the sweet delight of penance for a heart contrite. In the convent Flirty Marie is promoted to abbess through the intrigues of Rudolph. At first she refuses to accept this appointment because she feels unworthy. The old abbess persuades her, I shall say more, my dear daughter. If before entering the fold your life had been as full of error as, on the contrary, it was pure and praiseworthy, the evangelical virtues of which you have given an example since you have been here would have atoned for and redeemed your past in the eyes of the Lord, no matter how sinful it was. From what the abbess says, we see that Flirty Marie's earthly virtues have changed into evangelical virtues, or rather that her real virtues can no longer appear otherwise than as evangelical caricatures. Marie answers the abbess equals Holy Mother, I now believe that I can accept. Convent life does not suit Marie's individuality, she dies. Christianity consoles her only in imagination, or rather her Christian consolation is precisely the annihilation of her real life and essence, her death. So Rudolph first changed Flirty Marie into a repentant sinner, then the repentant sinner into a nun, and finally the nun into a corpse. At her funeral not only the Catholic priest, but also the critical priest Ch8-9 preaches a sermon over her grave. Her innocent existence he calls her transient existence, opposing it to eternal and unforgettable guilt. He praises the fact that her last breath was a prayer for forgiveness and pardon. But just as the Protestant minister, after expounding the necessity of the Lord's mercy, the participation of the deceased in universal original sin and the intensity of his consciousness of sin, must praise the virtues of the departed in earthly terms, so, too, Herr Ch8-9 uses the expression, and yet personally, she has nothing to ask forgiveness for. Finally he throws on Marie's grave the most faded flower of pulpit eloquence, inwardly pure as human beings seldom are. She has closed her eyes to this world. Amen. 3. Revelation of the mysteries of law. A. The maitre d'école, or the new penal theory. The mystery of solitary confinement revealed. Medical mysteries. The maitre d'école is a criminal of Herculean strength and great intellectual vigor. He was brought up an educated and well-schooled man. This passionate athlete comes into conflict with the laws and customs of bourgeois society, whose universal yardstick is mediocrity, delicate morals and quiet trade. He becomes a murderer and abandons himself to all the excesses of a violent temperament that can nowhere find a fitting human occupation. Rudolph captures this criminal. He wants to reform him critically and set him up as an example for the world of law. He quarrels with the world of law not over punishment itself, but over kinds and methods of punishment. He invents, as the Negro Dr. David aptly expresses it, a penal theory which would be worthy of the greatest German criminal expert, and which has since had the good fortune to be defended by a German criminal expert with German earnestness and German thoroughness. Rudolph has not the slightest idea that one can rise above criminal experts. His ambition is to be the greatest criminal expert, primus inter pares. He has the maitre d'école blinded by the Negro Dr. David. At first Rudolph repeats all the trivial objections to capital punishment, that it has no effect on the criminal and no effect on the people, for whom it seems to be an entertaining spectacle. Further, Rudolph establishes a difference between the maitre d'école and the soul of the maitre d'école. It is not the man, not the real maitre d'école whom he wishes to save. He wants the spiritual salvation of his soul. The salvation of a soul, he teaches, is something holy. Every crime can be atoned for and redeemed. The Savior said, but only if the criminal earnestly desires to repent and atone. The transition from the court to the scaffold is too short. You, the maitre d'école, have criminally misused your strength. I shall paralyze your strength. You will tremble before the weakest. Your punishment will be equal to your crime. But this terrible punishment will at least leave you the boundless horizon of atonement. I shall cut you off only from the outer world in order to plunge you into impenetrable night and leave you alone with the memory of your ignominious deeds. You will be forced to look into yourself. Your intelligence, which you have degraded, will be roused and will lead you to atonement. Since Rudolph regards the soul as holy and man's body as profane, since he thus considers only the soul to be the true essence, because according to Herschel's critical description of humanity it belongs to heaven, the body and the strength of the maitre d'école do not belong to humanity, the manifestation of their essence cannot be given human form or claimed for humanity and cannot be treated as essentially human. The maitre d'école has misused his strength. Rudolph paralyzes, lambs, destroys that strength. There is no more critical means of getting rid of the perverse manifestations of a human essential strength than the destruction of this essential strength. This is the Christian means, plucking out the eye if it offends or cutting off the hand if it offends, in a word, killing the body if the body gives offense, for the eye, the hand, the body are really only superfluous sinful appendages of man. Human nature must be killed in order to heal its ailments. Mass-type jurisprudence, too, in agreement here with the critical, sees in the laming and paralyzing of human strength the antidote to the objectionable manifestations of that strength. What Rudolph, the man of pure criticism, objects to in profane criminal justice is the too swift transition from the court to the scaffold. He, on the other hand, wants to link vengeance on the criminal with penance and consciousness of sin in the criminal, corporal punishment with spiritual punishment, sensuous torture with the non-sensuous torture of remorse. Profane punishment must at the same time be a means of Christian moral education. This penal theory, which links jurisprudence with theology, this revealed mystery of the mystery, is no other than the penal theory of the Catholic Church, as already expounded at length by Bentham in his work Punishments and Rewards. In that book Bentham also proved the moral futility of the punishments of today. He calls legal penalties legal parodies. The punishment that Rudolph imposed on the maitre d'école is the same as that which Origen imposed on himself. He emasculates him, robs him of a productive organ, the eye. The eye is the light of the body. It does great credit to Rudolph's religious instinct that he should hit, of all things, upon the idea of blinding. This punishment was current in the thoroughly Christian Empire of Byzantium and came to full flower in the vigorous youthful period of the Christian Germanic states of England and France. Cutting man off from the perceptible outer world, throwing him back into his abstract inner nature in order to correct him blinding is a necessary consequence of the Christian doctrine according to which the consummation of this cutting off, the pure isolation of man in his spiritualistic ego, is good itself. If Rudolph does not shut the maitre d'école up in a real monastery, as was the case in Byzantium and in Franconia, he at least shuts him up in an ideal monastery, in the cloister of an impenetrable night which the light of the outer world cannot pierce, the cloister of an idle conscience and consciousness of sin filled with nothing but the phantoms of memory. A certain speculative bashfulness prevents Herschel from discussing openly the penal theory of his hero Rudolph that worldly punishment must be linked with Christian repentance and atonement. Instead he imputes to him, naturally as a mystery which is only just being revealed to the world, the theory that punishment must make the criminal the judge of his own crime. The mystery of this revealed mystery is Hegel's penal theory. According to Hegel, the criminal in his punishment passes sentence on himself. Gans developed this theory at greater length. In Hegel this is the speculative disguise of the old jus talionis, which Kant expounded as the only juridical penal theory. For Hegel, self-judgment of the criminal remains a mere idea, a mere speculative interpretation of the current empirical punishments for criminals. He thus leaves the mode of application to the respective stage of development of the state, i.e. He leaves punishment as.it is. Precisely in that he shows himself more critical than his critical echo. A penal theory which at the same time sees in the criminal the man can do so only in abstraction, in imagination, precisely because punishment, coercion, is contrary to human conduct. Moreover, this would be impossible to carry out. Purely subjective arbitrariness would take the place of the abstract law, because it would always depend on the official, honorable and decent men to adapt the penalty to the individuality of the criminal. Plato long ago realized that the law must be one-sided and take no account of the individual. On the other hand, under human conditions punishment will really be nothing but the sentence passed by the culprit on himself. No one will want to convince him that violence from without, done to him by others, is violence which he had done to himself. On the contrary, he will see in other men his natural saviors from the punishment which he has imposed on himself. In other words, the relation will be reversed. Rudolf expresses his innermost thought purpose of blinding the maître d'école when he says to him, the Ch8-9 tu paroles sur une prière. He wants to teach him to pray. He wants to convert the Herculean robber into a monk whose only work is prayer. Compared with this Christian cruelty, how humane is the ordinary penal theory that just chops a man's head off when it wants to destroy him. Finally, it goes without saying that whenever real mass-type legislation was seriously concerned with improving the criminal, it acted incomparably more sensibly and humanely than the German Harun al-Rashid. The 4 Dutch agricultural colonies and the Ostwald penal colony in Alsace are truly human attempts in comparison with the blinding of the maître d'école, just as Rudolf kills Fleur Marie by handing her over to the priest and consciousness of sin, just as he kills Choriner by robbing him of his human independence and degrading him into a bulldog, so he kills the maître d'école by having his eyes gouged out in order that he can learn to prill. This is, of course, the way in which all reality merges simple, out of pure criticism, namely, as a distortion and senseless abstraction of reality. Immediately after the blinding of the maître d'école, Herr Schellige causes a moral miracle to take place. The terrible maître d'école, he reports, suddenly recognizes the power of honesty and decency and says to Schumann, yes, I can trust you, you have never stolen anything. Unfortunately Ch8-9 recorded a statement of the maître d'école about Choriner which contains the same recognition and cannot be the effect of his having been blinded, since it was made earlier. In talking to Rudolf alone, the maître d'école said about Choriner, besides, he is not capable of betraying a friend. No, there's something good in him, he has always had strange ideas. This would seem to do away with Herr Schellige's moral miracle. Now we shall see the real results of Rudolf's critical cure. We next meet the maître d'école as he is going with a woman called Ch8 to Balqueval farm to play a foul trick on Fleur Marie. The thought that dominates him is, of course, the thought of revenge on Rudolf. But the only way he knows of wreaking vengeance on him is metaphysically, by thinking and hatching evil to spite him. He has taken away my sight, but not the thought of evil. He tells Ch8 why he had sent for her. I was bored all alone with those honest people. When Ch8-9 satisfies his monkish, bestial lust in the self-humiliation of man to the extent of making the maître d'école implore on his knees the old hag Ch8 and the little imp tired not to abandon him, the great moralist forgets that that is the height of diabolical satisfaction for Ch8. Just as Rudolf, precisely by the violent act of blinding the criminal, proved to him the power of physical force, which he wants to show him is insignificant, so Ch8-9 now teaches the maître d'école really to recognize the full power of the senses. He teaches him to understand that without it man is unmanned and becomes a helpless object of mockery for children. He convinces him that the world deserved his crimes, for he had only to lose his sight to be ill-treated by it. He robs him of his last human illusion, for so far the maître d'école believed in Ch8's attachment to him. He had said to Rudolf, she would let herself be thrown into the fire for me. Ch8-9, on the other hand, has the satisfaction of hearing the maître d'école cry out in the depths of despair, Mon Dieu, mon Dieu, mon Dieu, he has learned to prill. In this apple involontaire de la commisération divine, Ch8-9 sees QUELQUE chose de providentiel. The first result of Rudolf's criticism is this spontaneous prayer. It is followed immediately by an involuntary atonement at Balqueval farm, where the ghosts of those whom the maître d'école murdered apatow him in a dream. We shall not give a detailed description of this dream. We next find the critically reformed maître d'école fettered in the cellar of the Bras Rouge, half devoured by rats, half starving and half insane as a result of being tortured by Ch8 and Tortired, and roaring like a beast. Tortired had delivered Ch8 to him. Let us watch the treatment he inflicts on her. He copies the hero Rudolf not only outwardly, by scratching out Ch8's eyes, but morally too by repeating Rudolf's hypocrisy and embellishing his cruel treatment with pious phrases. As soon as the maître d'école has Ch8 in his power he gives vent to a joie effrayante and his voice trembles with rage. You realize that I do not want to get it over at once. Torture for torture. I must have a long talk with you before killing you. It is going to be terrible for you. First of all, you see, since that dream at Balqueval farm which brought all our crimes back before me, since that dream which nearly drove me mad, and which will drive me mad, a strange change has come over me. I have become horrified at past cruelty. At first I would not let you torture the songstress, but that was nothing. By bringing me to this cellar and making me suffer cold and hunger, you left me to the terror of my own thoughts. Oh, you don't single quote know what it is to be alone. Isolation terrified me. I should not have thought it possible a proof that I am perhaps less of a blackguard than before. What an infinite joy I feel to have you in my power, you monster, not in order to revenge myself but to avenge our victims. Yes, I shall have done my duty. When I have punished my accomplice with my own, and I am now horrified at my past murders, and yet, don't you find it strange? It is without fear and quite calmly that I am going to commit a terrible murder on you, with terrible refinements. Tell me, do you understand that? 11 In those few words the maitre d' goes through a whole gamut of moral casuistry. His first words are a frank expression of his desire for vengeance. He wants to give torture for torture. Ch8 wants to murder Ch8, and he wants to prolong her agony by a long sermon. And delightful sophistry dash. The speech with which he tortures her is a sermon on morals. He asserts that his dream at Balqueval has improved him. At the same time he reveals the real effect of the dream by admitting that it almost drove him mad, and that it will actually do so. He gives as a proof of his reform that he prevented Fleur de Marie from being tortured. Ensue's personages earlier Ch8-9 and now the maitre d' must express, as the result of their thoughts, as the conscious motive of their actions, his own intention as a writer, which causes him to make them behave in a certain way and no other. They must continually say, I have reformed myself in this, in that, etc. Since their life has no real content, their words must give vigorous tones to insignificant features like the protection of Fleur de Marie. Having reported the salutary effect of his Balqueval dream, the maitre d' must explain why Ensu had him locked up in a cellar. He must find the novelist's procedure reasonable. He must say to Ch8, by locking me up in a cellar, causing me to be gnawed by rats and to suffer hunger and thirst, you have completed my reform. Solitude has purified me. The beastly roar, the wild fury, the terrible lust for vengeance with which the maitre d' welcomes Ch8 are in complete contradiction to this moralizing talk. They betray what kind of thoughts occupied him in his dungeon. The maitre d' himself seems to realize this, but being a critical moralist, he will know how to reconcile the contradictions. He declares that the infinite joy of having Ch8 in his power is precisely a sign of his reform, for his lust for vengeance is not a natural one but a moral one. He wants to avenge, not himself, but the common victims of Ch8 and himself. If he murders her, he does not commit murder, he fulfills a duty. He does not avenge himself on her, he punishes his accomplice like an impartial judge. He shudders at his past murders and, nevertheless, marveling at his own casuistry, he asks Ch8, don't you find it strange? Without fear and quite calmly, I'm going to kill you. On moral grounds that he does not reveal, he gloats at the same time over the picture of the murder that he's going to commit, as being terrible murder. Murder with terrible refinements. It is in accord with the character of the maitre d' that he should murder Ch8, especially after the cruelty with which she treated him. But that he should commit murder on moral grounds, that he should give a moral interpretation to his savage pleasure in the terrible murder and the terrible refinements, that he should show his remorse for the past murders precisely by committing a fresh one, that from a simple murderer he should become a murderer in the double sense, a moral murderer. All this is the glorious result of Rudolph's critical cure. Ch8 tries to get away from the maitre d'. He notices it and holds her fast. Keep still, Ch8, I must finish explaining to you how I gradually came to repentance. This revelation will be hateful to you, and it will also show you how pitiless I must be in the vengeance I want to wreak on you in the name of our victims. I must hurry. The joy of having you here in my hands makes the blood pound in my veins. I shall have time to make the approach of your death terrifying to you by forcing you to listen to me. I'm blind and my thoughts take a shape, a body, such that they incessantly present to me visibly, almost palpably the features of my victims. The ideas are reflected almost materially in my brain. When repentance is linked with an atonement of terrifying severity, an atonement that changes our life into a long sleeplessness filled with hallucinations of revenge or desperate reflections, then, perhaps, the pardon of men follows remorse and atonement. The maitre d' continues with his hypocrisy, which every minute betrays itself as such. Ch8 must hear how he came by degrees to repentance. This revelation will be hateful to her, for it will prove that it is his duty to take a pitiless revenge on her, not in his own name, but in the name of their common victims. Suddenly the maitre d' interrupts his didactic lecture. He must, he says, hurry with his lecture, for the pleasure of having her in his hands makes the blood pound in his veins. That is a moral reason for cutting the lecture short. Then he calms his blood again. The long time that he takes in preaching her a moral sermon is not wasted for his revenge. It will make the approach of death terrifying for her. That is a different moral reason, one for protracting his sermon. And having such moral reasons he can safely resume his moral text where he left off. The maitre d' describes correctly the condition to which isolation from the outer world reduces a man. For one to whom the sensuously perceptible world becomes a mere idea, for him mere ideas are transformed into sensuously perceptible beings. The figments of his brain assume corporeal form. A world of tangible, palpable ghosts is begotten within his mind. That is the secret of all pious visions, and at the same time it is the general form of insanity. When the maitre d' repeats Rudolph's words about the power of repentance and atonement linked with terrible torments, he does so in a state of semi-madness, thus proving in fact the connection between Christian consciousness of sin and insanity. Similarly, when the maitre d' considers the transformation of life into a night of dream filled with ghosts as the real result of repentance and atonement, he is expressing the true mystery of pure criticism and of Christian reform, which consists in changing man into a ghost and his life into a life of dream. At this point Ensu realizes how the salutary thoughts which he makes the blind robber prate after Rudolph will be made ridiculous by the robber's treatment of Ch8. That is why he makes the maitre d' say, the salutary influence of these thoughts is such that my rage is appeased. So the maitre d' now admits that his moral wrath was nothing but profane rage. I lack courage, strength, will to kill you. No, it is not for me to shed your blood. It would be murder. Excusable murder, perhaps, but murder all the same. Ch8 wounds the maitre d' with a dagger just in time. Ensu can now let him kill her without any further moral casuistry. He uttered a cry of pain. His fierce passion of vengeance, of rage and of bloodthirsty instinct, suddenly aroused and exacerbated by this attack, had a sudden and terrible outburst in which his already badly shaken reason was shattered. Viper! I have felt your fag. You will be sightless as LM. And he scratches her eyes out. When the nature of the maitre d' which has been only hypocritically, sophistically disguised, only subtly repressed by Rudolph's cure, breaks out, the outburst is all the more violent and terrifying. We must be grateful to Oigensu for his admission that the reason of the maitre d' was badly shaken by all the events which Rudolph has prepared. The last spark of his reason was extinguished in that cry of terror, in that cry of a damned soul. He sees the ghosts of his murdered victims. The maitre d' rages and roars like a frenzied beast. He tortures Ch8 to death. Herr Schleiger mutters under his breath. With the maitre d' there cannot be such a swift, and fortunate, transformation, as with Schumann. Just as Rudolph sends Flirty Marie into a convent, he makes the maitre d' an inmate of the Beister asylum. He has paralyzed his spiritual as well as his physical strength. And rightly, for the maitre d' sinned with his spiritual as well as his physical strength, and according to Rudolph's penal theory the sinning forces must be annihilated. But Oigensu has not yet consummated the repentance and atonement linked with a terrible revenge. The maitre d' recovers his reason, but fearing to be delivered to justice he remains in Beister and pretends to be mad. Monsieur Sue forgets that every word he said was to be a prayer, whereas finally it is much more like the inarticulate howling and raving of a madman. Or does Monsieur Sue perhaps ironically put these manifestations of life on the same level as praying? The idea underlying the punishment that Rudolph carried out in blinding the maitre d' the isolation of the man and his soul from the outer world, the combination of legal punishment with theological torture finds its ultimate expression in solitary confinement. That is why Monsieur Sue glorifies this system. How many centuries had to pass before it was realized that there is only one means of overcoming the rapidly spreading leprosy, i.e., the corruption of morals, in prisons, which is threatening the body of society, isolation. Monsieur Sue shares the opinion of the worthy people who explain the spread of crime by the organization of prisons. To remove the criminal from bad society he is left to his own society. Oigensu says, I should consider myself lucky if my weak voice could be heard among all those which so rightly and so insistently demand the complete and absolute application of solitary confinement. Monsieur Sue's wish has been only partially fulfilled. In the debates on solitary confinement in the Chamber of Deputies this year, even the official supporters of that system had to acknowledge that it leads sooner or later to insanity in the criminal. All sentences of imprisonment for more than 10 years had therefore to be converted into deportation. Had Messieurs Tocqueville and Beaumont studied Oigensu's novel thoroughly, they would certainly have secured complete and absolute application of solitary confinement. If Oigensu deprives criminals with a sane mind of society in order to make them insane, he gives insane persons society to make them sane. Experience proves that isolation is as fatal for the insane as it is salutary for imprisoned criminals. If Monsieur Sue and his critical hero Rudolph have not made law poor by any mystery, whether through the Catholic penal theory or the Methodist solitary confinement, they have, on the other hand, enriched medicine with new mysteries, and after all, it is just as much of a service to discover new mysteries as to disclose old ones. In its report on the blinding of the maitre d' critical criticism fully agrees with Monsieur Sue. When he is told he is deprived of the light of his eyes he does not even believe it. The maitre d' could not believe in the loss of his sight, because in reality he could still see. Monsieur Sue is describing a new kind of cataract and is reporting a real mystery for mass type, uncritical ophthalmology. The pupil is white after the operation, so it is a case of cataract of the crystalline lens. So far, this could, of course, be caused by injury to the envelope of the lens without causing much pain, though not entirely without pain. But as doctors achieve this result only by natural, not by critical means, the only resort was to wait until inflammation set in after the injury and the exudation dimmed the lens. A still greater miracle and greater mystery befall the maitre d' in the 3rd chapter of the 3rd book. The man who has been blinded sees again. Ch8, the maitre d' and Tourtière saw the priest and Flirty Marie. If we do not interpret this restoration of the maitre d' ability to see as an author's miracle after the method of the Critique de Synoptique, the maitre d' must have had his cataract operated on again. Later he is blind again. So he used his eyes too soon and the irritation of the light caused inflammation which ended in paralysis of the retina and incurable amaurosis. It is another mystery for uncritical ophthalmology that this process takes place here in a single second. B. Reward and punishment. Double justice. With a table, the hero Rudolph reveals a new theory to keep society upright by rewarding the good and punishing the wicked. Uncritically considered, this theory is nothing but the theory of society as it is today. How little lacking it is in rewards for the good and punishments for the wicked. Compared with this revealed mystery, how uncritical is the mass-type communist Owen, who sees in punishment and reward the consecration of differences in social rank and the complete expression of a servile abasement. It could be considered as a new revelation that Oigensu makes rewards derived from the judiciary. From a new appendix to the penal code, and not satisfied with one jurisdiction he invents a second. Unfortunately this revealed mystery, too, is the repetition of an old theory expounded in detail by Bentham in his work already mentioned. On the other hand, we cannot deny Monsieur Oigensu the honor of having motivated and developed Bentham's suggestion in an incomparably more critical way than the latter. Whereas the mass-type Englishman keeps his feet on the ground, Sue's deduction rises to the critical region of the heavens. His argument is as follows: the supposed effects of heavenly wrath are materialized to deter the wicked. Why should not the effect of the divine reward of the good be similarly materialized and anticipated on earth? In the uncritical view it is the other way round. The heavenly criminal theory has only idealized the earthly theory, just as divine reward is only an idealization of human wage service. It is absolutely necessary that society should not reward all good people, so that divine justice will have some advantage over human justice. In depicting his critical rewarding justice, Monsieur Sue gives an example of the feminine dogmatism that must have a formula and forms it according to the categories of what exists, dogmatism which was censured with all the tranquility of knowledge by Herr Edgar in Flora Tristan. For each point of the present penal code, which he retains, Monsieur Sue projects the addition of a counterpart in a reward code copied from it to the last detail. For easier survey we shall give his description of the complementary pairs in tabular form. Table of critically complete justice existing justice name, criminal justice critically supplementing justice description, holds in its hand a sword to shorten name, virtuous justice description, holds in its hand a crown to raise the wicked by a head. Purpose, punishment of the wicked, good by a head. Imprisonment, infamy, deprivation of life. The people is notified of the terrible chastisements for purpose, reward of the good, free board, honor, maintenance of life. The people is notified of the brilliant triumphs for the good. The wicked. Means of discovering the wicked. Police spying. Mouchards, to keep watch over. Condition of the virtuous criminal after sentence, under surveillance de loud police. Is fed in prison. The state defrays expenses. Execution, the criminal Ch8-9. Is fed at home. The state defrays expenses. Execution, immediately opposite the scaffold of the criminal a pedestal is erected on which the grand Humpty Bean stands. Stands on the scaffold. Pillory of virtue. Moved by the sight of this picture, Monsieur Sue exclaims, "Alas! It is a utopia. But suppose a society were organized in this way. That would be the critical organization of society. We must defend this organization against Ch8-9's reproach that up to now it has remained a utopia." Sue has again forgotten the Virtue Prize, which is awarded every year in Paris, and which he himself mentions. This prize is even organized in duplicate, the material pre-Montaigne for noble acts of men and women, and the pre-Rosière for girls of highest morality. There is even the wreath of roses demanded by Ch8-9. As far as spying on virtue and the supervision of supreme moral charity are concerned, they were organized long ago by the Jesuits. Moreover, the Journal des Débats, Petites Sophiques de Paris, etc., point out and proclaim the virtues, noble acts and merits of all the Paris stock jobbers daily and at cost price, not counting the pointing out and proclamation of political noble acts, for which each party has its own organ. Old Voss remarked long ago that Homer is better than his gods. The revealed mystery of all mysteries, Rudolph, can therefore be made responsible for Ch8-9's ideas. In addition, Herr Schleiger reports, besides, the passages in which Ch8-9 interrupts the narration and introduces or concludes episodes are very numerous, and all are critical. See abolition of degeneracy within civilization and of rightlessness in the state. The ideal preventive means for the abolition of crime and hence of degeneracy within civilization consists in the protective guardianship assumed by the state over the children of executed criminals or of those condemned to a life sentence. Sue wants to organize the subdivision of crime in a more liberal way. No family should any longer have a hereditary privilege to crime. Free competition in crime should triumph over monopoly. Monsieur Sue abolishes rightlessness in the state by reforming the section of the Code Penal on confidence tricks, and especially by the institution of paid lawyers for the poor. He finds that in Piedmont, Holland, etc., where there are lawyers for the poor, rightlessness in the state has been abolished. The only failing of French legislation is that it does not provide for payment of lawyers for the poor, has no lawyers restricted to serving the poor, and makes the legal limits of poverty too narrow. As if rightlessness did not begin in the very lawsuit itself, and as if it had not already been known for a long time in France that the law gives nothing, but only sanctions what exists. The already trivial differentiation between droit and fate seems still to be a mystère de Paris for the critical novelist. If we add to the critical revelation of the mysteries of law the great reforms which Ch8-9 wants to institute in respect of huissiers, we shall understand the Paris journal Satan. There we see the residents of a district in the city write to the Grand Reformateur Tantlai that there is no gas light yet in their streets. Monsieur Sue replies that he will deal with this shortcoming in the 6th volume of his Wandering Jew. Another part of the city complains of the shortcomings of preliminary education. He promises a preliminary education reform for that district of the city in the 10th volume of the Wandering Jew. 4. The revealed mystery of the standpoint. Rudolph does not remain at his lofty standpoint. He does not shirk the trouble of adopting by free choice the standpoints on the right and on the left, above and below. One of the principal mysteries of critical criticism is the standpoint and judgment from the standpoint of the standpoint. For criticism every man, like every product of the spirit, is turned into a standpoint. Nothing is easier than to see through the mystery of the standpoint when one has seen through the general mystery of critical criticism, that of warming up old speculative trash. First of all, let criticism itself expound its theory of the standpoint in the words of its patriarch, Herr Bruno Bauer. Science never deals with a given single individual or a given definite standpoint. It will not fail, of course, to do away with the limitations of a standpoint if it is worth the trouble and if these limitations have really general human significance, but it conceives them as pure category and determinations of self-consciousness and accordingly speaks only for those who have the courage to rise to the generality of self-consciousness, i.e., who do not wish with all their strength to remain within those limitations. Anecdota, T.11. The mystery of this courage of Bauer's is Hegel's phenomenology. Because Hegel here substitutes self-consciousness for man, the most varied manifestations of human reality appear only as definite forms, as determinateness of self-consciousness. But mere determinateness of self-consciousness is a pure katego, a mere thought which I can consequently also transcend in pure thought and overcome through pure thought. In Hegel's phenomenology, the material, sensuously perceptible, objective foundations of the various estranged forms of the human self-consciousness are allowed to remain. The whole destructive work results in the most conservative philosophy because it thinks it has overcome the objective world, the sensuously perceptible real world, by transforming it into a thing of thought, a mere determinateness of self-consciousness, and can therefore also dissolve its opponent, which has become ethereal, in the ether of pure thought. The phenomenology is therefore quite consistent in that it ends by replacing human reality by absolute knowledge, because this is the only mode of existence of self-consciousness, and because self-consciousness is considered the only mode of existence of man, absolute knowledge for the very reason that self-consciousness knows only itself, and is no longer disturbed by any objective world. Hegel makes man the man of self-consciousness instead of making self-consciousness the self-consciousness of man, of real man, i.e., of man living also in a real, objective world and determined by that world. He stands the world on its head and can therefore in his head also dissolve all limitations, which nevertheless remain in existence for bad sensuousness, for real men. Moreover, everything that betrays the limitations of general self-consciousness or sensuousness, reality, individuality of men and of their world necessarily held by him to be a limit. The whole of the phenomenology is intended to prove that self-consciousness is the only reality and all reality. Herr Bauer has recently rechristened absolute knowledge criticism, and given the more profane-sounding name standpoint to the determinateness of self-consciousness. In the anecdota both names are still to be found side by side, and standpoint is still explained as the determinateness of self-consciousness. Since the religious world as such exists only as the world of self-consciousness, the critical critic, the theologian ex-professor, cannot by any means entertain the thought that there is a world in which consciousness and being are distinct, a world which continues to exist when I merely abolish its existence in thought, its existence as a category or as a standpoint, i.e., when I modify my own subjective consciousness without altering the objective reality in a really objective way, that is to say, without altering my own objective reality and that of other men. Hence the speculative mystical identity of being and thinking is repeated in criticism as the equally mystical identity of practice and theory. That is why criticism is so vexed with practice which wants to be something distinct from theory, and with theory which wants to be something other than the dissolution of a definite category in the boundless generality of self-consciousness. Its own theory is confined to stating that everything determinate is an opposite of the boundless generality of self-consciousness and is, therefore, of no significance. For example, the state, private property, etc. It must be shown, on the contrary, how the state, private property, etc. turn human beings into abstractions, or are products of abstract man, instead of being the reality of individual, concrete human beings. Finally, it goes without saying that whereas Hegel's phenomenology, in spite of its speculative original sin, gives in many instances the elements of a true description of the human relations, Herr Bruno and company, on the other hand, provide only an empty caricature, a caricature which is satisfied with deriving any determinateness out of a product of the spirit, or even out of real relations and movements, changing this determinateness into a determinateness of thought, into a category, and making out that this category is the standpoint of the product, of the relation and the movement, in order then to be able to look down on this determinateness triumphantly with old man's wisdom from the standpoint of abstraction, of the general category and of general self-consciousness. Just as in Rudolph's opinion all human beings maintain the standpoint of good or bad and are judged by these two immutable conceptions, so for Herr Bauer and company all human beings adopt the standpoint of criticism or that of the mass, but both turn real human beings into abstract standpoints. 5. Revelation of the mystery of the utilization of human impulses, or Clemens de Harville. So far Rudolph has been unable to do more than reward the good and punish the wicked in his own way. We shall now see an example of how he makes the passions useful and gives the good natural disposition of Clemens de Harville an appropriate development. Rudolph, says Herr Schleiger, draws her attention to the entertaining aspect of charity, a thought which testifies to a knowledge of human beings that can only arise in the soul of Rudolph after it has been through trial. Lee the expressions which Rudolph uses in his conversation with Clemens. To make attractive, to utilize natural taste, to regulate intrigue, to utilize the propensity to dissimulation and craft, to change imperious, inexorable instincts into noble qualities, etc. These expressions, just as much as the impulses themselves, which are mostly attributed here to woman's nature, betray the secret source of Rudolph's wisdom, Fourier. He has come across some popular presentation of Fourier's theory. The application is again just as much Rudolph's critical own as is the exposition of Bentham's theory given above. It is not in charity as such that the young marquise is to find the satisfaction of her essential human nature, a human content and purpose of her activity, and hence entertainment. Charity offers rather only the external occasion, only the pretext, only the material, for a kind of entertainment that could just as well use any other material as its content. Misery is exploited consciously to procure the charitable person the piquancy of a novel, the satisfaction of curiosity, adventure, disguise, enjoyment of his or her own excellence, violent nervous excitement, and the like. Rudolph has thereby unconsciously expressed the mystery which was revealed long ago, that human misery itself, the infinite abjectness which is obliged to receive alms, must serve the aristocracy of money and education as a plaything to satisfy its self-love, tickle its arrogance and amuse it. The numerous charitable associations in Germany, the numerous charitable societies in France, and the great number of charitable quixotic societies in England, the concerts, balls, plays, meals for the poor, and even the public subscriptions for victims of accidents, have no other object It seems then that along these lines charity, too, has long been organized as entertainment. The sudden, unmotivated transformation of the Marquise at the mere word "amusant" makes us doubt the durability of her cure, or rather this transformation is sudden and unmotivated only in appearance, and is caused only in appearance by the description of Ch8 as an amusement. The Marquise loves Rudolph and Rudolph wants to disguise himself along with her, to intrigue and to indulge in charitable adventures. Later, when the Marquise pays a charity visit to the prison of St. Lazare, her jealousy of Flirty Marie becomes apparent, and out of charity towards her jealousy she conceals from Rudolph the fact of Marie's retention. At the best, Rudolph has succeeded in teaching an unhappy woman to play a silly comedy with unhappy beings. The mystery of the philanthropy he has hatched is betrayed by the Paris fop who invites his partner to supper after the dance in the following words. "Ah, madam, it is not enough to have danced for the benefit of these poor Poles. Let us see philanthropy to the end. Let us have supper now for the benefit of the 6. Revelation of the mystery of the emancipation of women, or Louise Morel. On the occasion of the arrest of Louise Morel, Rudolph indulges in reflections which he sums up as follows. The master often ruins the maid, either by fear, surprise or other use of the opportunities provided by the nature of the servant's condition. He reduces her to misery, shame and crime. The law is not concerned with this. The criminal who has in fact driven a girl to infanticide is not punished. Rudolph's reflections do not go so far as to make the Sen/Ant's condition the object of his most gracious criticism. Being a petty ruler, he is a great patronizer of servants' conditions. Still less does he go so far as to understand that the general position of women in modern society is inhuman. Faithful in all respects to his previous theory, he deplores only that there is no law which punishes a seducer and links repentance and atonement with terrible chastisement. Rudolph has only to take a look at the existing legislation in other countries. English laws fulfill all his wishes. In their delicacy, which Blackstone so highly praises, they go so far as to declare it a felony to seduce even a prostitute. Herschel exclaims with a flourish, "So thinks I, Rudolph." And now compare these thoughts with your fantasies about the emancipation of woman. The act of this emancipation can be almost physically grasped from them, but you are much too practical to start with, and that is why your attempts have failed so often. In any case, we must thank Herschel for revealing the mystery that an act can be almost physically grasped from thoughts. As for his ridiculous comparison of Rudolph with men who taught the emancipation of woman, compare Rudolph's thoughts with the following fantasies of Fourier. Adultery, seduction, are a credit to the seducer, are good tone. But, poor girl, infanticide. What a crime. If she prizes her honor, she must efface all traces of dishonor. But if she sacrifices her child to the prejudices of the world, her ignominy is all the greater, and she is a victim of the prejudices of the law. That is the vicious circle which every civilized mechanism describes. Is not the young daughter a work held up for sale to the first bidder who wishes to obtain exclusive ownership of her? Just as in grammar two negations are the equivalent of an affirmation, we can say that in the marriage trade two prostitutions are the equivalent of virtue. The change in a historical epoch can always be determined by women's progress towards freedom, because here, in the relation of woman to man, of the weak to the strong, the victory of human nature over brutality is most evident. The degree of emancipation of woman is the natural measure of general emancipation. The humiliation of the female sex is an essential feature of civilization as well as of barbarism. The only difference is that the civilized system raises every vice that barbarism practices in a simple form to a compound, equivocal, ambiguous, hypocritical mode of existence. No one is punished more severely for keeping woman in slavery than man himself. Fourier. It is superfluous to contrast Rudolph's thoughts with Fourier's masterly characterization of marriage, or with the works of the materialist section of French communism. The most pitiful offscourings of socialist literature, a sample of which is to be found in this novelist, reveal mysteries still unknown to critical criticism. 7. Revelation of political economic mysteries. A theoretical revelation of political economic mysteries. First revelation, wealth often leads to waste, waste to ruin. Second revelation, the above-mentioned effects of wealth arise from a lack of instruction in rich youth. Third revelation, inheritance and private property are and must be inviolable and sacred. Fourth revelation, the rich man is morally responsible to the workers for the way he uses his fortune. A large fortune is a hereditary deposit, feudal tenement entrusted to clever, firm, skillful and magnanimous hands, which are at the same time charged with making it fruitful and using it in such a way that everything which has the good luck to be within the range of the dazzling and wholesome radiation of that large fortune is fructified, vitalized and improved. Fifth revelation, the state must give inexperienced rich youth the rudiments of individual economy. It must give a moral character to riches. Sixth revelation, finally, the state must tackle the vast question of organization of labor. It must give a wholesome example of the association of capitals and labor, of an association which is honest, intelligent and fair, which ensures the well-being of the worker without prejudice to the fortune of the rich, which establishes links of sympathy and gratitude between these two classes and thus ensures tranquility in the state forever. Since the state at present does not yet accept this theory, Rudolph himself gives some practical examples. They reveal the mystery that the most generally known economic relations are still mysteries for Monsieur Sue, Monsieur Rudolph and critical criticism. B. The Bank for the Poor. Rudolph institutes a bank for the poor. The statute of this critical bank for the poor is as follows. It must give support during periods of unemployment to honest workers with families. It must replace alms and pawn shops. It has at its disposal an annual income of 12,000 francs and distributes interest-free assistance loans of 20 to 40 francs. At first it extends its activity only to the 7th arrondissement of Paris, where most of the workers live. Working men and women applying for relief must have a certificate from their last employer vouching for their good behavior and giving the cause and date of the interruption of work. These loans are to be paid off in monthly installments of 1/6 or 1/12 of the sum at the choice of the borrower, counting from the day on which he finds employment again. The loan is guaranteed by the borrower's word of honor. Moreover, the latter's parole jury must be guaranteed by 2 other workers. As the critical purpose of the Bank for the Poor is to remedy one of the most grievous misfortunes in the life of the worker, interruption in employment assistance would be given only to unemployed manual workers. Monsieur Germain, the manager of this institution, draws a yearly salary of 10,000 francs. Let us now cast a mass-type glance at the practice of critical political economy. The annual income is 12,000 francs. The amount loaned per person is from 20 to 40 francs, hence an average of 30 francs. The number of workers in the 7th arrondissement who are officially recognized as needy is at least 4,000. Hence, in a year only 400, or 1/10, of the neediest workers in the 7th arrondissement can receive relief. If we estimate the average length of unemployment in Paris at 4 months, i.e., 16 weeks, we shall be considerably below the actual figure. 30 francs divided over 16 weeks gives somewhat less than 37 sous and 3 centimes a week, not even 27 centimes a day. The daily expense on one prisoner in France is on the average a little over 47 centimes, somewhat over 30 centimes being spent on food alone. But the worker to whom Monsieur Rudolph pays relief has a family. Let us take the average family as consisting of man, wife and only 2 children. That means that 27 centimes must be divided among 4 persons. From this we must deduct rent minimum of 15 centimes a day, so that 12 centimes remain. The average amount of bread eaten by a single prisoner costs about 14 centimes. Therefore, even disregarding all other needs, the worker and his family will not be able to buy even a quarter of the bread they need with the help obtained from the critical bank for the poor. They will certainly starve if they do not resort to the means that the bank is intended to obviate: the pawn shop, begging, thieving and prostitution. The manager of the Bank for the Poor, on the other hand, is all the more brilliantly provided for by the man of ruthless criticism. The income he administers is 12,000 francs, his salary is 10,000. The management therefore costs 85% of the total, nearly 3 times as much as the mass-type administration of poor relief in Paris, which costs about 17% of the total. Let us suppose for a moment that the assistance that the Bank for the Poor proved us is real, not just illusory. In that case the institution of the revealed mystery of all mysteries rests on the illusion that only a different distribution of wages is required to enable the workers to live through the year. Speaking in the prosaic sense, the income of 7,500,000 French workers averages no more than 91 francs per head, that of another 7,500,000 is only 120 francs per head, hence for at least 15 million it is less than is absolutely necessary for life. The idea of the critical bank for the poor, if it is rationally conceived, amounts to this: during the time the worker is employed as much will be deducted from his wages as he needs for his living during unemployment. It comes to the same thing whether I advance him a certain sum during his unemployment and he gives it back when he has employment, or he gives up a certain sum when he has employment and I give it back to him when he is unemployed. In either case he gives me when he is working what he gets from me when he is unemployed. Thus, the pure bank for the poor differs from the mass-type savings banks only in 2 very original, very critical qualities. The first is that the bank for the poor lends money a fons perdis on the senseless assumption that the worker could pay back if he wanted to and that he would always want to pay back if he could. The second is that it pays no interest on the sum put aside by the worker. As this sum is given the form of an advance, the bank for the poor thinks it is doing the worker a favor by not charging him any interest. The difference between the critical bank for the poor and the mass-type savings banks is therefore that the worker loses his interest and the bank its capital. See Model Farm at Bouqueval. Rudolph founds a model farm at Bouqueval. The choice of the place is all the more fortunate as it preserves memories of feudal times, namely of a Ch8-9. Each of the 6 men employed on this farm is paid 150 écus, or 450 francs a year, while the women get 60 écus, or 180 francs. Moreover, they get board and lodging free. The ordinary daily fare of the people at Bouqueval consists of a formidable plate of ham, an equally formidable plate of mutton and, finally, a no less massive piece of veal supplemented by 2 kinds of winter salad, 2 large cheeses, potatoes, cider, etc. Each of the 6 men does twice the work of the ordinary French agricultural laborer. As the total annual income produced by France, if divided equally, would come to no more than 93 francs per person, and as the total number of inhabitants employed directly in agriculture is 2/3 of the population of France, it will be seen what a revolution the general imitation of the German Caliph's model farm would cause not only in the distribution, but also in the production of the national wealth. According to what has been said, Rudolph achieved this enormous increase in production solely by making each laborer work twice as much and eat 6 times as much as before. Since the French peasant is very industrious, laborers who work twice as much must be superhuman athletes, as the formidable meat dishes also seem to indicate. Hence we may assume that each of the 6 men eats at least a pound of meat a day. If all the meat produced in France were distributed equally, there would not be even a quarter of a pound per person per day. It is therefore obvious what a revolution Rudolph's example would cause in this respect too. The agricultural population alone would consume more meat than is produced in France, so that as a result of this critical reform France would be left without any livestock. The 5th part of the gross product which Rudolph, according to the report of the manager of Bouqueval, Father Ch8-9, allows the laborers, in addition to the high wage and sumptuous board, is nothing else than his rent. It is assumed that, on the average, after deduction of all production costs and profit on the working capital, 1/5 of the gross product remains for the French landowner. That is to say, the ratio of the rent to the gross product is 1 to 5. Although it is beyond doubt that Rudolf decreases the profit on his working capital beyond all proportion by increasing the expenditure for the laborers beyond all proportion, according to Chapitre d'Industrie Française, Ch8-9, the average yearly income of the French agricultural laborer is 120 francs. Although Rudolf gives his whole rent away to the laborers, Father Ch8-9 nevertheless reports that the prince thereby increases his revenue and thus inspires uncritical landowners to farm in the same way. The Bouqueval model farm is nothing but a fantastic illusion. Its hidden fund is not the natural land of the Bouqueval estate. It is a magic purse of fortunatus that Rudolf has. In this connection, critical criticism exultantly declares, you can see from the whole plan at a first glance that it is not a utopia. Only critical criticism can see at a first glance at a fortunatus purse that it is not a utopia. The first glance of criticism is the glance of the evil eye. 8. Rudolf, the revealed mystery of all mysteries. The miraculous means by which Rudolf accomplishes all his redemptions and miracle cures is not his fine words but his ready money. That is what the moralists are like, says Feuerbach. You must be a millionaire to be able to imitate their heroes. Moral is impotence in action. Every time it fights a vice it is defeated. And Rudolf does not even rise to the standpoint of independent morality, which is based at least on the consciousness of human dignity. His morality, on the contrary, is based on the consciousness of human weakness. His is the theological morality. We have investigated in detail the heroic feats that he accomplished with his fixed, Christian ideas, by which he measures the world, with his Ch8. Devoutment, abnegation, repentive, bonds, and recompense, and punition, chatiments, isolement, salatiam, etc. We have meekants, terribles, prove that they are mere Eulenspiegel tricks. All that we still have to deal with here is the personal character of Rudolf, the revealed mystery of all mysteries, or the revealed mystery of pure criticism. The antithesis of good and evil confronts the critical Hercules when he is still a youth in two personifications, Murph and Polidori, both of them Rudolf's teachers. The former educates him in good and is the good one, the latter educates him in evil and is the evil one, so that this conception should by no means be inferior in triviality to similar conceptions in other novels. Murph, the personification of the good, cannot be savant or particularly endowed intellectually, but he is honest, simple, and laconic. He feels himself great when he applies to evil such monosyllabic words as foul or vile, and he has horror of anything which is base. To use Hegel's expression, he honestly sets the melody of the good and the true in an equality of tones, I.E., on one note. Polidori, on the contrary, is a prodigy of cleverness, knowledge and education, and at the same time of the most dangerous immorality, having, in particular, what Oygensu, as a member of the young pious French bourgeoisie, could not forget la plus effrayant skepticism. We can judge the spiritual energy and education of Oygensu and his hero by their panic fear of skepticism. Murph, says Herr Schelliger, is at the same time the perpetuated guilt of January 13th and the perpetual redemption of that guilt by his incomparable love and self-sacrifice for the person of Rudolf. Just as Rudolf is the deus ex machina and the mediator of the world, so Murph, for his part, is the personal deus ex machina and mediator of Rudolf. Rudolf and the salvation of mankind, Rudolf and the realization of man's essential perfections, are for Murph an inseparable unity, a unity to which he dedicates himself not with the stupid dog-like devotion of the slave, but knowingly and independently. So Murph is an enlightened, knowing and independent slave. Like every prince's valet, he sees in his master the salvation of mankind personified. Grand flatters Murph with the words, intrepid garde du corps. Rudolf himself calls him model d'un valet, and truly he is a model servant. Oygensu tells us that Murph scrupulously addresses Rudolf as Monsignor when alone with him. In the presence of others he calls him Monsieur with his lips to keep his incognito, but Monsignor with his heart. Murph helps to raise the veil from the mysteries, but only for Rudolf's sake. He helps in the work of destroying the power of mystery. The denseness of the veil which conceals the simplest conditions of the world from Murph can be seen from his conversation with the envoy Grand. From the legal right of self-defense in case of emergency he concludes that Rudolf, as judge of the secret court, was entitled to blind the maître d'école, although the latter was in chains and defenseless. His description of how Rudolf will tell of his noble actions before the assizes, will make a display of eloquent phrases, and will let his great heart pour forth, is worthy of a grammar school boy who has just read Schiller's Räuber. The only mystery which Murph lets the world solve is whether he blacked his face with coal dust or black paint when he played the charbonnier. The angel shall come forth and sever the wicked from among the just. Tribulation and anguish upon every soul of man that doth evil. But glory, honor, and peace, to every man that worketh good. Rudolf makes himself one of those angels. He goes forth into the world to sever the wicked from among the just, to punish the wicked and reward the good. The conception of good and evil has sunk so deep into his weak brain that he really believes in a corporeal Satan, and wants to catch the devil alive, as at one time Professor Sack wanted to in Bonn. On the other hand, he tries to copy on a small scale the opposite of the devil, God. He likes the jur uncula rodi. La Providence. Just as in reality all differences become merged more and more in the difference between poor and rich, so all aristocratic differences become dissolved in idea in the opposition between good and evil. This distinction is the last form that the aristocrat gives to his prejudices. Rudolf regards himself as a good man and thinks that the wicked exist to afford him the self-satisfaction of his own excellence. Let us consider this personification of the good a little more closely. Herr Rudolf indulges in charity and extravagance like the Caliph of Baghdad in the Arabian Nights. He cannot possibly lead that kind of life without sucking the blood out of his little principality in Germany to the last drop like a vampire. As Monsieur Sue tells us, he would have been among the German princes who were victims of mediation had he not been saved from involuntary abdication by the protection of a French marquis. This gives us an idea of the size of his territory. We can form a further idea of how critically Rudolf appraises his own situation by the fact that he, a minor German Serenissima, thinks it necessary to live semi-incognito in Paris in order not to attract attention. He specially takes with him one of his chancellors for the critical purpose of the latter representing for him le cote théâtral et puéril du pouvoir souverain, as though a minor German Serenissimus needed another representative of the theatrical and childish side of sovereign power besides himself and his mirror. Rudolf has succeeded in imposing on his suite the same critical self-delusion. Thus his servant Murph and his envoy Grand do not notice that the Parisian hound affairs, Monsieur Bedinot, makes fun of them when he pretends to take their private instructions as matters of state and sarcastically chatters about occult relations that can exist between the most varying interests and the destinies of empires. Yes, says Rudolf's envoy, he has the impudence to say to me sometimes, how many complications unknown to the people there are in the government of a state. Who would think, Herr Baron, that the notes which I deliver to you doubtless have their influence on the course of European affairs? 111 The envoy and Murph do not find it impudent that influence on European affairs is ascribed to them, but that Badinot idealizes his lowly occupation in such a way. Let us first recall a scene from Rudolf's domestic life. Rudolf tells Murph he was having moments of pride and bliss. Immediately afterwards he becomes furious because Murph will not answer a question of his. Je vous ordonne de parler. Murph will not let himself be ordered. Rudolf says, Je n'aime pas les reticences. He forgets himself so far as to be base enough to remind Murph that he pays him for all his services. He will not be calmed until Murph reminds him of January 13th. Murph's servile nature reasserts itself after its momentary abeyance. He tears out his hair, which he luckily has not got, and is desperate at having been somewhat rude to his exalted master who calls him a model servant. His good old faithful Murph. After these samples of evil in him, Rudolf repeats his fixed ideas on good and evil and reports the progress he is making in regard to the good. He calls alms and compassion the chaste and pious consolers of his wounded soul. It would be horrible, impious, a sacrilege, to prostitute them to abject, unworthy beings. Of course alms and compassion are the consolers of his soul. That is why it would be a sacrilege to desecrate them. It would be to inspire doubt in God, and he who gives must make people believe in him. To give alms to one abject is unthinkable. Rudolf considers every motion of his soul as infinitely important. That is why he constantly observes and appraises them. Thus the simpleton consoles himself as far as his outburst against Murph is concerned by the fact that he was moved by Fleur de Marie. I was moved to tears, and am accused of being blasé, hard and inflexible. 11 After thus proving his own goodness, he waxes furious over evil, over the wickedness of Marie's unknown mother, and says with the greatest possible solemnity to Murph, you know, some vengeances are very dear to me, some sufferings very precious. In speaking, he makes such diabolical grimaces that his faithful servant cries out in fear, Hellas, Monseigneur? 11 This great lord is like the members of Young England, who also wish to reform the world, perform noble deeds, and are subject to similar hysterical fits. The explanation of the adventures and situations in which Rudolf finds himself involved is to be found above all in Rudolf's adventurous disposition. He loves the piquancy of novels, distractions, adventures, disguise. His curiosity is insatiable. He feels a need for vigorous, stimulating sensations. He is eager for violent nervous excitement. This disposition of Rudolf is reinforced by his craze for playing the role of Providence and arranging the world according to his fixed ideas. His attitude to other persons is determined either by an abstract fixed idea or by quite personal, fortuitous motives. He frees the Negro Dr. David and his beloved, for example, not because of the direct human sympathy which they inspire, not to free them, but to play Providence to the slave owner Willis and to punish him for not believing in God. In the same way the maitre d'école seems to him a God-sent opportunity for applying the penal theory that he invented so long ago. Murph's conversation with the envoy Grum enables us from another aspect to see deeply into the purely personal motives that determine Rudolf's noble acts. The prince's interest in Fleur de Marie is based, as Murph says, apart from the pity which the poor girl inspires, on the fact that the daughter, whose loss caused him such bitter grief, would now be of the same age. Rudolf's sympathy for the Marquis d'Harville has, apart from his philanthropic idiosyncrasies, the personal ground that without the old Marquis d'Harville and his friendship with the Emperor Alexander, Rudolf's father would have been deleted from the line of German sovereigns. His kindness towards Madame George and his interest in Germain, her son, have the same motive. Madame George belongs to the d'Harville family. It is no less to her misfortunes and her virtues than to this relationship that poor Madame George owes the ceaseless kindness of his highness. The apologist Murph tries to gloss over the ambiguity of Rudolf's motives by such expressions as, certes, apart, non moins que. The whole of Rudolf's character is finally summed up in the pure hypocrisy by which he manages to see and make others see the outbursts of his evil passions as outbursts against the passions of the wicked, in a way similar to that in which critical criticism represents its own stupidities as the stupidities of the mass, its spiteful rancor at the progress of the world outside itself as the rancor of the world outside itself at progress, and finally its egoism, which thinks it has absorbed all spirit in itself, as the egoistic opposition of the mass to the spirit. We shall prove Rudolf's pure hypocrisy in his attitude to the maitre d'école, to Countess Sarah MacGregor, and to the notary Jacques Ferrand. In order to lure the maitre d'école into a trap and seize him, Rudolf persuades him to break into his apartment. The interest he has in this is a purely personal one, not a general human one. The fact is that the maitre d'école has a portfolio belonging to Countess MacGregor, and Rudolf is greatly interested in gaining possession of it. Speaking of Rudolph's tete-a-tete with the maitre d'école, the author says explicitly, Rudolph was cruelly anxious. If he let slip this opportunity of seizing the maitre d'école, he would probably never have another. The brigand would carry away the secrets that Rudolph was so keen to find out. With the maitre d'école, Rudolph obtains possession of Countess MacGregor's portfolio. He seizes the maitre d'école out of purely personal interest. He has him blinded out of personal passion. When Ch8-9 tells Rudolph of the struggle of the maitre d'école with Murph and gives as the reason for his resistance the fact that he knew what was in store for him, Rudolph replies, he did not know, and he says with a somber mien, his features contracted by the almost ferocious expression of which we have spoken. The thought of vengeance flashes across his mind. He anticipates the savage pleasure that the barbarous punishment of the maitre d'école will afford him. On the entrance of the Negro Dr. David, whom he intends to make the instrument of his revenge, Rudolph cries out, Vengeance! Vengeance ale esse crier Idolfi ave comfortur Freud et concentre. A cold and concentrated fury is seething in him. Then he whispers his plan in the doctor's ear, and when the latter recoils at it, he immediately finds a pure, theoretical motive to substitute for personal vengeance. It is only a case, he says, of applying an idea that has often flashed across his noble mind, and he does not forget to add unctuously, he will still have before him the boundless horizon of atonement. He follows the example of the Spanish Inquisition which, when handing over to civil justice the victim condemned to be burnt at the stake, added a hypocritical request for mercy for the repentant sinner. Of course, when the interrogation and sentencing of the maitre d'école is to take place, His Highness is seated in the most comfortable study in a long, deep black dressing gown, his features impressively pale, and in order to copy the court of justice more faithfully, he is sitting at a long table on which are the exhibits of the case. He must now discard the expression of rage and revenge with which he told Ch8-9 and the doctor of his plan for blinding the maitre d'école. He must show himself calm, sad and composed, and display the extremely comic, solemn attitude of a self-styled world judge. In order to leave no doubt as to the pure motive of the blinding, the silly Murph admits to the envoy Gron, the cruel punishment of the maitre d'école was intended chiefly to give me my revenge against the assassin. In a tete-a-tete with Murph, Rudolph says, my hatred of the wicked has become stronger, my aversion for Sarah Baggs, doubtless because of the grief caused by the death of my daughter. Rudolph tells us how much stronger his hatred of the wicked has become. Needless to say, his hatred is a critical, pure, moral hatred of the wicked because they are wicked. That is why he regards this hatred as his own progress in the good. At the same time, however, he betrays that this growth of moral hatred is nothing but a hypocritical justification to excuse the growth of his personal aversion for Sarah. The vague moral idea of his increasing hatred of the wicked is only a mask for the definite moral fact of his increased aversion for Sarah. This aversion has a very natural and a very personal basis, his personal grief, which is also the measure of his aversion. Sans doute. Still more repugnant is the hypocrisy to be seen in Rudolph's meeting with the dying Countess MacGregor. After the revelation of the mystery that Flirty Marie is the daughter of Rudolph and the Countess, Rudolph goes up to her naked, impitoable, she begs for mercy. Pas grace, he replies. Malediction sur vous dot vous. Mon mauvais génie et jaloux de ma race. So it is his race that he wishes to avenge. He goes on to inform the Countess how, to atone for his attempted murder of his father, he has taken upon himself a world crusade for the reward of the good and the punishment of the wicked. He tortures the Countess, he abandons himself to his rage, but in his own eyes he is only carrying out the task which he took upon himself after January 13th, of Poursuivre-le-Mal. As he is leaving, Sarah cries out, Pity. Je meurs. I meurs donc, Mauditel de Tradolfi effrayant de Führer. The last words effrayant de Führer betray the pure, critical and moral motives of his actions. It was the same rage that made him draw his sword against his father, his blessed father, as Herr Ch8-9 calls him. Instead of fighting this evil in himself he fights it, like a pure critic, in others. In the end, Rudolph himself discards his Catholic penal theory. He wanted to abolish capital punishment, to change punishment into penance, but only as long as the murderer murdered strangers and spared members of Rudolph's family. He adopts the death penalty as soon as one of his kin is murdered. He needs a double set of laws, one for his own person and one for ordinary persons. He learns from Sarah that Jacques Ferrand was the cause of the death of Flirty Marie. He says to himself, no, it is not enough. What a burning desire for revenge. What a thirst for blood. What calm, deliberate rage. Until I knew that one of the monster's victims was my child, I said to myself, this man's death would be fruitless. Life without money, life without satisfaction of his frenzied sensuality will be a long and double torture. But it is my daughter. I shall kill this. And he rushes out to kill him, but finds him in a state which makes murder superfluous. The good Rudolph, burning with desire for revenge, thirsting for blood, with calm, deliberate rage, with a hypocrisy which excuses every evil impulse with its casuistry, he has all the evil passions for which he gouges out the eyes of others. Only accidental strokes of luck, money and rank in society save this good man from the penitentiary. The power of criticism to compensate for the otherwise complete nullity of this Don Quixote makes him bon locataire, bon voisin, bon ami, bon père, bon bourgeois, bon citoyen, bon prince, and so on, according to Herr Ch8-9's gamut of eulogy. That is more than all the results that mankind in its entire history has achieved. That is enough for Rudolph to save the world twice from downfall. Chapter 9. The critical last judgment through Rudolph. Critical criticism has twice saved the world from downfall, but only that it may now itself decree the end of the world. And I saw and heard a mighty angel, Herr Herzl, flying from Zurich across the heavens. And he had in his hand a little book open like the 5th number of the Allgemeine Literaturzeitung. And he set his right foot upon the mat and his left foot upon Charlottenburg, and he cried with a loud voice as when a lion roareth, and his words rose like a dove chirp, chirp, to the regions of pathos and thunder-like aspects of the critical last judgment. When, finally, all is united against criticism, and verily, verily I say unto you, this time is no longer far off, when the whole world in dissolution to it was given to fight against the holy groups around criticism for the last onslaught, then the courage of criticism and its significance will have found the greatest recognition. We can have no fear of the outcome. It will all end by our settling accounts with the various groups, and we shall separate them from one another as the shepherd separateth the sheep from the goats, and we shall set the sheep on our right hand and the goats on our left, and we shall give a general certificate of poverty to the hostile knights. They are spirits of the devil. They go out into the breadth of the world, and they gather to fight on the great day of God the Almighty, and all who dwell on earth will wonder. And when the angel had cried, 7 thunders uttered their voices, that day of wrath will reduce the world to ashes. When the judge takes his seat, all that is hidden will come to light, nothing will remain unpunished. What shall I, wretch, say then? Etc. Ye shall hear of wars and rumors of wars. All this must first of all come to pass. For there shall rise false Christs and false prophets, Messieurs Buques and Roux from Paris, Herr Friedrich Romer and Theodor Romer from Zurich, and they will say, Here is Christ. But then the sign of the Bauer brothers will appear in criticism, and the words of the scripture on Bauer's work will be accomplished, with the oxen paired together. Cluingo's much better historical epilogue, as we learned later, it was not the world, but the critical literators that came to an end. Thesis on Feuerbach, 1845, translated by Karl Manchester. The main deficiency, up to now, in all materialism including that of Feuerbach is that the external object, reality and sensibility are conceived only in the form of the object and of our contemplation of it, rather than as sensuous human activity and as practice, as something non-subjective. For this reason, the active aspect has been developed by idealism, in opposition to materialism, though only abstractly, since idealism naturally does not know real, sensuous activity as such. Feuerbach wants sensuous objects, clearly distinguished from mental objects, but he does not conceive human activity in terms of subject and object. That is why, in the essence of Christianity, he regards only theoretical activity as authentically human, whilst practice is conceived and defined only in its dirty Jewish manifestation. He therefore does not understand the meaning of revolutionary, of practical critical activity. The question whether objective truth can be attributed to human thinking is not a question of theory, but a practical question. Man must prove in practice the truth the reality and power, the worldliness of his thinking. Isolated from practice, the controversy over the reality or unreality of thinking is a purely scholastic question. The materialist doctrine that humans are products of circumstances and upbringing, and that, therefore, men who change are products of new circumstances and a different upbringing, forgets that circumstances are changed by men themselves, and that it is essential to educate the educator. Necessarily, then, this doctrine divides society into two parts, one of which is placed above society, for example, in the work of Robert Owen. The coincidence of changing circumstance on the one hand, and of human activity or self-changing on the other, can be conceived only as revolutionary practice, and rationally understood. Feuerbach starts out from the fact of religious self-alienation and the duplication of the world into an imagined religious world and a real world. His work consists in resolving the religious world into its secular basis. He overlooks that, once this work is completed, the central task remains to be done. But the fact that the secular basis detaches from itself and fixes in the clouds as an independent realm can be explained only by the self-negation and self-contradiction within it. This must be first of all understood in the context of its contradictions, and then be revolutionized by the removal of those contradictions. Thus, for instance, once the earthly family is discovered to be the secret of the Holy Family, the former must then be theoretically critiqued and practically overthrown. Feuerbach, not satisfied with abstract thinking, appeals to sensory intuition, but he does not conceive the realm of the senses in terms of practical, human sensuous activity. Feuerbach resolves the religious essence into the human essence. But the human essence is not an abstraction inherent in each single individual. In its reality, it is the ensemble of social conditions. Feuerbach, who does not undertake a criticism of this real essence, is therefore compelled 1. To abstract from the historical process and to fix the religious sentiment as something by itself and to presuppose an abstract isolated human individual. 2. For this reason, he can consider the human essence only as a genus, as an internal, mute generality which naturally unites the multiplicity of individuals. Feuerbach therefore does not see that religious sentiment is itself a social product, and that the abstract individual that he analyzes belongs in reality to a particular social form. Social life is essentially practical. All the mysteries which turn theory towards mysticism find their rational solution in human practice and in the understanding of this practice. 9. The highest point reached by intuitive materialism, that is, materialism which does not comprehend the activity of the senses as practical activity, is the point of view of single individuals in bourgeois society. The standpoint of the old materialism is bourgeois society. The standpoint of the new is human society, or socialized mankind. 11. Philosophers have only interpreted the world in different ways. What is crucial, however, is to change it. The Poverty of Philosophy, 1847.